10th bill to move through the full committee. I expect that we'll have a lively discussion today. I hope you understand that we do operate under some form of time constraints. We can't meet while the House is in session, so the shorter the better with your remarks, and I know that you will obey that command. Now, without further ado, let me introduce Mr. Crenshaw, Chairman Crenshaw, for his opening statement on his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think, as everybody knows, this subcommittee has jurisdiction over a diverse group of agencies and activities. It includes financial regulators, tax collection, the White House, federal courts, D.C., General Services Administration, the Small Business Administration. And this bill we're considering today will provide $21.3 billion in discretionary funding, which is $566 billion, or 2.6% less than fiscal year 2014, and $2.3 billion, or 9.6% below the request. The subcommittee's allocation is a reduction, but it's one that is necessary to live within the Ryan Murray discretionary budget cap. The allocation is sufficient to fund priority programs while reducing funding for activities that are not essential to the operation of the federal government or that have a history of wasting taxpayers' resources. One of the main priorities of the bill is funding for law enforcement activities. The high-intensity drug trafficking area program receives a $6.5 million increase over last year. The Drug-Free Communities program gets $3 million increase. The Treasury's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence Activities, which develop and enforce sanction programs, receives an $18 million increase. Another priority for the bill is supporting small businesses and assisting in private sector job creation. The bill provides $195 million for SBA's business loan programs. That supports $18.5 billion in 7A lending and $7.5 billion in 504 lending. The bill also provides increases over the current year for the Small Business Development Centers, the Women's Business Centers, and the Treasury's Community Development Financial Institutional Fund Program. Now, in order to live within our allocation, we had to reduce the funding in some areas. We eliminate 9 programs, such as the Christopher Columbus Foundation and the Election Assistance Commission. They're neither necessary nor critical to the operation of the federal government. We reduce funding for more than a dozen agencies and programs that can operate with a little bit less, like the General Services Administration, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Federal Communications Commission. And in order to increase transparency and accountability of agencies that were created by Dodd-Frank, this bill makes the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Office of Financial Research subject to the appropriations process and requires reports on their activities. Dodd-Frank created these agencies and purposefully put their funding outside the annual review of Congress, and this bill corrects that flaw. The bill drops language that's been included in the bill for several decades, requiring Postal Service to deliver the mail on Saturdays. The Postmaster General, the President, the House Authorizing Committee have asked us to drop this language. GAO says that the Postal Service is, quote, facing a deteriorating financial situation. CBO estimates that dropping this requirement will save the Postal Service about $1.2 billion in 2015 and over $13 billion over the next decade. Now, I know this is a controversial topic, and we'll certainly discuss it later today. And finally, let me discuss the IRS. This committee remains troubled by their activities, including the inappropriate singling out of certain tax-exempt groups based on their political beliefs, wasteful spending on conferences and videos, and providing bonuses. So this bill provides the IRS with $10.95 billion. That's $341 million below the current level, and it's $1.5 billion below their request. This funds the IRS below their fiscal year 2008 8 level. Now, the IRS has betrayed the trust of the American people, and the IRS has a long way to go to restore that trust. It seems like every day we learn about a new chapter where the IRS has either demonstrated a bureaucratic incompetence or willful disregard for the law, in some cases maybe even both. So we need to continue to rein in the IRS until they can better be stewards of the money they have. Now, in addition, the committee includes language which prohibits funds for employee bonuses and awards for IRS employees that do not consider the conduct and tax compliance of such employees. It prohibits funds for targeting groups for regulatory scrutiny based on their ideological beliefs or for exercising their First Amendment rights. It prohibits funds for inappropriate conferences and videos. It requires a report on the amount of official time used by IRS employees for union activities. And it prohibits the White House from ordering the IRS to determine the tax-exempt status of an organization. And it requires extensive reporting on IRS spending. Language is also included prohibiting funds for Treasury to implement or revise regulations regarding the standards and definitions used to determine the tax-exempt status of organizations under Section 501c4 of the Internal Revenue Code. I believe the administration should wait until the investigations into the inappropriate singling out of certain tax-exempt groups based on their political beliefs are completed before proposing to make any regulatory changes regarding Section 501c4. I believe it's outrageous that the IRS expects Americans to keep their tax records for 7 years, but it's not capable of retaining their own emails from a few years ago. In addition, I believe the IRS should have no role in the implementation of the Affordable Care Act at a time when the IRS has demonstrated little ability to either self-police or self-correct. I find this expansion of IRS authority to be unacceptable, and therefore the bill prohibits funding for implementing the individual mandate and prohibits transfers from the Department of Health and Human Services to fund IRS implementation of the Affordable Care Act. And so I want to thank all the members of the subcommittee for their input in the bill. I want to thank Chairman Rogers for his assistance in moving the bill forward. I want to thank all of our staff, the majority and the minority staff. And finally, I want to say a special thank you to the ranking member, Mr. Serrano. I appreciate his approach to the committee's work. I appreciate his desire to get back to regular order. His input has improved the bill, and I know he doesn't agree with everything in the bill, and I know he believes there should be additional funds in the bill, but I look forward to working with him as we move this bill forward. Yield back my time.
Mr. Serrano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by thanking Chairman Crenshaw for his efforts to conduct this subcommittee in a fair and bipartisan manner. We not always agree on everything, but you are willing, Mr. Crenshaw, to listen to our side, and you have made efforts to accommodate our side's priorities. Unfortunately, I think Chairman Crenshaw has been dealt a difficult hand with this bill. This subcommittee received a totally inadequate 302B allocation compared to our funding level in fiscal year 2014. The bill is $566 million below the level agreed to in the fiscal year 2014 omnibus. This cut is equal to 2.6% of the bill, a level that no other subcommittee has been forced to take. The result is that there are several agencies in this bill that are not funded properly. Despite this insufficient allocation, I do want to point out several areas in this bill that has made improvements upon. The CDFI fund is funded at $230 million, an increase over last year. The Small Business Administration also receives adequate funding for several important programs, including the microloan program, the Prime program, and the Small Business Development Centers. Our federal defenders are funded at slightly over the revised request level. And lastly, the bill allows for a cost of living adjustment for wage-grade employees. However, I think these areas are unfortunately overwhelmed by the problematic portions of the bill. A major concern is the funding level for the Internal Revenue Service, which is funded at $10.95 $1.5 billion, a cut of $341 million below last year. This means the agency would operate at a level that is below sequestration. I do not know of another agency that is asked to take a cut to a level below the sequester, but I do know the reason why. Yet another misguided attempt to punish the agency for the problems associated with the 501c4 unit and hamstring it during the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. Unfortunately, the real result of this cut will be to simply prevent the agency from collecting money from tax cheats and to increase our deficit as a result. Now, very briefly, Chairman Crenshaw said he doesn't think that the IRS should be involved in the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, but the fact is that the other side believes no agency should be involved in the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, which is the law of the land. The Securities and Exchange Commission is also severely underfunded at a level of $1.4 billion. This is $300 million below the request and is simply insufficient to allow the agency to properly oversee Wall Street and protect investors. Both parties have created additional responsibilities for the SEC in recent years, but funding has not kept pace. If we keep asking the agency to do more with less, then we cannot be surprised if we experience another financial crisis. Additionally, for the first time since 1983, this subcommittee did not include a requirement that the Postal Service maintain 6-day delivery. I'm highly disappointed that we have not included this important and long-standing provision that has bipartisan support. Today, I will join with Mr. Latham to offer a bipartisan amendment to restore this long-standing provision. Millions of Americans depend upon reliable 6-day delivery, especially the elderly and those living in rural areas. There are numerous other cuts to the bill that are harmful as well, including the elimination of the Election Assistance Commission. And the chairman said that it's no longer needed, but many of us know that there are laws being approved in different states in this country where having a proper way of voting and a secure way of voting is still the order of the day. So the elimination of the Election Assistance Commission, I think, is a tragedy. And a funding cut to the D.C. TAG program. However, I believe the biggest impediment to reaching compromise on this bill is the large number of partisan writers that continue to be attached to this bill. And let me tell you that this may not be the case, and I honestly believe this, that these writers grow out only out of this committee. I think these writers grow out of a whole section of the House. And as I've said on many occasions, it is the way to go back home and to say, I'm strong on the issue of abortion. Where? Well, in D.C. I'm strong on the issue of same-sex marriage. Where? Well, in D.C. I'm strong on this, I'm strong on that. And so we, for years, have used writers in this bill attacking the District of Columbia and to be able to go back home and say that we're strong on issues when, in fact, those issues are dealt with differently in those other communities that we represent. It's just that we use D.C. as that sort of colonial structure that we will mistreat. And you know how I feel about colonies. Being born in Puerto Rico, I have a special interest in this issue. Some of the writers are more excessive than others, all of which are major concerns to our side. There are writers preventing the IRS from implementing the Affordable Care Act and from reforming the 501c4 regulations, which have caused so much confusion and abuse. There are writers needlessly and baselessly attacking the president on signing statements and on executive orders. There is a writer limiting Americans' ability to travel to Cuba on a people-to-people visas. There is a writer preventing the SEC from requiring publicly traded companies to disclose their campaign donations to their shareholders, even though there is no indication that the agency has plans to do so. And there is, of course, a writer preventing the District of Columbia from using its own funds to provide legal abortion services to low-income women. This is by no means an exclusive list. The number of writers attached to this bill goes on and on and on. We have spent a lot of time this year discussing how to ensure that we return to regular order. I would suggest that it is extremely difficult to do so when the majority attempts to pack legislation with a laundry list of partisan priorities, and I mean writers. This is irresponsible governing at best. The end of the fiscal year is quickly approaching, and instead of working towards compromise, we have chosen to create obstructions that will make it more difficult for the Appropriations Committee to complete its work. And we wonder why Congress has such low approval ratings. Our side will attempt to remedy some of these defects with amendments today, although with the inadequate allocation, it will be difficult to do so. Unfortunately, as it is currently written, I am sad to say that this is not a bill that I can support. Before I finish, let me take a moment to thank the staff on both sides of the aisle for their hard work on this bill. They have all devoted many hours to creating this bill and report. And I know I speak for all the members on our side when I say that we are grateful. And let me end by saying, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Rogers, that I think you know me well enough to know that I take my role in this committee seriously, and I would want nothing more to be able to say, let's pass this bill by unanimous voice vote. But there are so many difficulties, especially with the riders, that make it difficult, and I hope that we can remedy some of that today, and I hope as we go on, we can bring the kind of bill to the floor that we can all support. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank Chairman Crenshaw and the Ranking Member Serrano on successfully bringing this bill out of subcommittee and to this committee. I know that your hard work and your commitment to working together highlight what I've long believed to be the hallmarks of this great committee. I'm grateful to these two members and the subcommittee members and staff for bringing this bill before us today so that we can continue our forward momentum on passing all 12 appropriations bills. This bill today covers a vast array of important programs and services, including the Treasury, our small businesses, and the judiciary. The legislation provides $21.3 billion, $566 million below last year's levels. The bill makes serious strides to rein in poor-performing agencies and to increase accountability across the government. The bill includes strong terms and conditions on funding and makes agencies face the scrutiny of Congress and the appropriations process. The bill also makes cuts to lower priority programs that have proven to be less than careful with precious tax dollars. Let me highlight some of the priorities. Enforcing our laws is one of the top priorities in this bill. To continue all federal court activities at a timely and efficient rate, funding for the federal judiciary is increased by 2.5% above current levels. The bill also targets funding to enforce our drug laws and to battle drug abuse. For instance, the bill provides $245 million for high-intensity drug trafficking areas, HIDAs, an increase above the President's request for this important and effective program. The bill also increases funding for the Drug-Free Communities program above the request, helping improve access to successful community-based prevention and treatment activities and initiatives. It bears repeating here, and I've said this many times before, the nation has a real prescription pill problem. We have more people die from prescription drug abuse than car wrecks. And yet the nation seems to be asleep at the wheel. It amazes me that we can't generate more interest in tackling that problem head on. But this bill does its part. Investing in America's small businesses, also a priority in the bill. $862 million for SBA to help our small businesses prosper and create more American jobs. But as I said earlier, to reduce spending in this bill, a cut of 2.6%, less than last year, tough choices had to be made, as the chairman has said. For example, the budget for the IRS has been reduced by $1.5 billion below the president's request. This funding is sufficient for the agency to perform its core duties, but will require IRS management to make better and more efficient choices. We also placed many oversight requirements and funding prohibitions on this agency, the result of its previous improper use of taxpayer dollars and its inappropriate actions targeting groups based on political beliefs. These include prohibitions on the production of inappropriate videos and conferences, and on giving employees bonuses or awards unless their professional conduct is given consideration. The bill also prohibits funding for the implementation of a proposed new regulation to determine tax-exempt status under Section 501c4, a troubling proposal that has the potential for infringement on America's First Amendment rights. And the bill also prohibits funding for the IRS to implement the individual health care mandate created by Obamacare on the American people. There has been so much chaos and confusion on the operation of Obamacare, and so many last-minute changes to the implementation. How can we possibly allow the IRS to fine American citizens even if they try to comply with this dysfunctional law? Regardless of your personal beliefs on the value and legitimacy of the Affordable Care Act, it is simply unfair and unjust to get a visit from the tax collectors because of the administration's botched rollout of this law. And then lastly, the bill increases the transparency of the federal government by bringing the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Office of Financial Research under the Congressional Appropriations process, meaning oversight and accountability. These provisions, along with the strict oversight mandated in the bill, will force these agencies to be more transparent and more accountable to the American people. This is a good bill that will streamline these agencies, force them to act within the bounds of our laws, respect American taxpayers, and live within a fiscally responsible budget. So I urge my colleagues to support this bill today. Now, Mrs. Lloyd will give her opening remarks.
I'd like to thank Chairman Crenshaw, Ranking Member Serrano, for their work on this bill and the bipartisan spirit in which they worked. Unfortunately, however, low allocations and policy riders in this bill fail to prioritize the middle class, create jobs, provide opportunity for every citizen to succeed. Meanwhile, this bill cuts already reduced funding levels for regulatory agencies that protect the public and crack down on special interests who abuse the system. For our economy to succeed, investors must have faith that regulators do their jobs to protect consumers' financial interests, especially at a time when we are recovering from the economic harm caused by risky industry practice. Yet this bill could put mom-and-pop investors and our entire economy at risk with inadequate funding authority for the SEC at $300 million below the request. This is outrageous when you consider that the SEC's funding does not take a dime of U.S. taxpayer dollars or impact the deficit or the debt because it is entirely fee-funded. In the last fiscal year, due to budget constraints, the SEC examined only about 9% of registered investment advisors. The number of investment advisors has increased by 40% over the past decade, and assets under management have more than doubled. And yet the SEC's funding has not kept up with the need. It's clear this bill should do more to protect investors and ensure that industry does not resume practices that endanger Americans' hard-earned money. Cuts to the IRS budget by more than $340 million to below fiscal year 2008 levels would make it easier, frankly, for tax cheats to go undetected and more difficult for law-abiding taxpayers to get assistance. While we can all agree that recent events at the IRS warrant further oversight, these cuts are excessive. Other troublesome measures in this bill attempt to dictate local governance decisions for Washington, D.C., and prohibit implementation of health reforms that have given millions of Americans affordable health coverage for the first time. It is also full of riders that unnecessarily involve abortion, needle exchanges, even a denial of funds for D.C. voting rights. If Congress imposed these demands on any other area of the country, and particularly areas represented by some of my friends on the other side of the aisle, I expect many would stringently criticize the federal government imposing on your way of life and in your local decisions. These efforts are unfair to the citizens of Washington, D.C. Now, there are some bright spots in the bill. I appreciate the chairman and the ranking member supporting some of my long-standing priorities, including funding for the Small Business Administration, business loan accounts, increased funding for the drug-free communities and the high-intensity drug trafficking areas program, which are crucial as communities throughout the nation grapple with a heroin epidemic. I hope that we can protect these investments, and I do hope that my colleagues can continue to work together to improve this bill going forward. Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady. Is there further discussion? Chairman Freeland has it.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to recognize one of those bright spots in the bill and commend Chairman Crenshaw for including $15 million for the District of Columbia Opportunity Scholarship Program. 11 years ago, this committee took some action, taking a look at the high rate of failure of some of the district's schools to give a hand up to children in the district by creating the District of Columbia Opportunity Scholarship Program. The program's been a huge success. Last year, 98% of high school graduates who were Opportunity Scholarship recipients enrolled at a 2- or 4-year college, and last year alone, over 3,000 high school students submitted applications to participate in these scholarships, and the program accepted about 1,500. This has been a remarkable program. It was mired in controversy when it first started, but I want to commend the committee for continuing this for the District of Columbia. Yield back the balance of my time.
Ms. Kaptur.
Mr. Chairman, members, I also wanted to thank the chairman and the ranking member for including in the bill my request to increase funding by a very small amount for the Community Development Revolving Loan Fund. It's no secret that more Americans are falling into poverty, and the rating of Congress, by the way, is 7%, I think, and that's equally shared on both sides of the aisle, so we all have a lot of soul-searching to do on trying to meet the needs of the American people as we move forward with important bills like this. There's no question that the number of members being served in credit unions that serve low income has increased dramatically. And this is a very small program, and one I wish that could more effectively function with proper with proper support to meet the real need that exists across our country. But, Mr. Chairman, I wanted to just make an observation. This is one of those bills where it seems that the list of agencies is endless. And so it's like having 1,000 little cuts, but you don't see the whole. And I wanted to express the opinion that there's something wrong in a country when 6 financial institutions control 2/3 of the wealth, and you have large numbers of Americans falling into poverty. Certain Wall Street executives take home hundreds of millions of dollars when other people simply are crashing around this country. We simply need a more competitive financial system. We don't have it. We don't have it. And as we watched what followed the crash of 2008 and the lack of justice to those who created this great chasm in our country, the American people lose faith. They lose faith in the fundamental structure of our financial system. I wanted to put a couple figures on the table. You know, to have too big to fail institutions in control while people at the bottom can hardly even find a decent place to deposit their money with proper financial services isn't right. Home ownership is declining. That's not good for the country. Everybody should have a piece of the rock. And we see predatory practices across this country where very unsavory financial institutions are taking root in some of the places that have been harmed the most. Let me give you a figure. The estimated wealth losses from the spillover effects of foreclosures just in the African American community in our country was $194 billion. The African American community lost 1/3 of its accumulated wealth since World War II. In the Hispanic community, it's 44% loss, losing over $177 billion. The financial system is not operating on an even keel. Those at the top are making lots more, and everybody else, the middle class is shrinking, those in poverty are shrinking, and our financial institutions are not meeting the need of the American people. We've got more debt, less savings, $17 trillion debt, gigantic trade deficit year after year after year. The fundamentals of the economy are really out of whack. This is an important bill. We're losing sight of the big picture. We're going to argue over different agencies today and whether this one got enough or didn't get enough. But overall, the ship is not headed in the right direction because too many people are falling out. And that isn't good for capitalism. It isn't good for home ownership. It isn't good for the fundamentals of this financial system because the fees are going up for people. If you are able to put deposit in a bank, for example, it's just too expensive for ordinary people. And so I will be speaking when the Postal Service amendments come up. I think in many places where there are no financial institutions left in communities, the Postal Service can actually solve some of its financial problems by being allowed to offer more financial services in neighborhoods that have been stripped of prudent financial intermediaries. There are ways to solve this, but we better think hard about how the American people are withdrawing from their belief that the system can really work for them because it has failed them. And as we get into these multiplicity of agencies, let's take a look at the real problems: rising debt, lower savings, lower home ownership, many communities with only predatory financial institutions, not prudent financial institutions. This is a really important bill, and I look forward to the debate ahead, and I thank you for listening.
Is there further discussion? The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was told that you didn't get a microphone because you've been on the committee for a while. Much less learn how to
There's a
operate
reason
one.
for
Thank
that,
you,
too.
Mr. Chairman.
Some truth to that.
In keeping with the earlier discussion, I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for the work they've done, and I noticed that there's been some concern regarding some of the riders with respect to the Internal Revenue Service, and I want to just provide an update in an area that I think everyone will have an interest in. And that's about something that I think is getting ready to happen in a couple of days. Not the usual topic of discussion with the Internal Revenue Service, but started about 4 years ago when then Commissioner Schulman launched a registered tax return preparer program, which mandated that all paid tax return preparers complete 15 hours of continuing education annually, and take an annual competency exam. Now, those concepts in and of themselves are interesting and probably a legitimate subject of conversation as we go forward talking about the IRS. The problem is that nowhere in existing statute, according to a United States District Court and a United States District Court of Appeal, because the case was taken up as they proceeded, that the IRS doesn't have any statutory authority to do such a thing. And so they needed that statutory authority. Although of interest, the case is called Loving versus IRS. Now that's somebody's name, not a concept, so you don't have that juxtaposition in terms of two concepts. But the reason that I bring it up at this point in time is to call it to your attention is because as a result of being ruled against at the district court level and then ruled against at the District Court of Appeal level, the IRS filed a notice that they weren't going to go forward with an appeal to the Supreme Court. Instead, they plan to create a voluntary program which basically has all the same attributes of the one that was ruled they didn't have authority for. And you say, why are you telling us about this? You know, it's kind of on the old trust meter and the credibility meter, where you are now going forward after two court decisions that said you don't have the authority to do this and say it's going to be a voluntary program. But guess what? If you complete the voluntary program, you get to display something that says you are a certified IRS tax preparer. So when we talk about the middle class, and by the way, that affects about 700,000 preparers throughout the nation. So imagine the millions of people that pay to have their return done. Go see somebody that has a certified label versus whatever you may have been doing. The potential to create confusion about, well, this person is certified, before you get into the issues which this committee, for one, would be very good at hearing, which is, well, who's going to administer the test? Who's going to administer the continuing legal education credits? Because if it's subterfuge for you will prepare and you will answer the questions on the test correctly to be certified by the agency that enforces it, I would submit that most of us would have a problem with that. But we don't get that opportunity. Because guess what? In the coming days, it's my understanding they're moving forward with this new voluntary program, and without delay, will be formally issuing through a revenue procedure, creating this voluntary program. Now, I don't know what it costs to do that, but I would submit when we talk about an agency that has resource constraints and things that may be better in IT areas, but they do have the money to do something like this, is an interesting concept. I would just point it out in this context. Unambiguous court ruling that wasn't appealed, you have a decision to say, well, we're going to turn it into voluntary to get around that, and we are still not coming to the appropriate committees of jurisdiction in the Congress to institute such a program. So when you talk about riders, it's like, well, you know what, here's an instance where the trust factor is at or near zero, and therefore you're trying to anticipate it. I hope those days come to a close, but I do want to bring it to your attention because I think it's something that transcends partisan issues, and it's a policy area where this committee ought to be rightfully involved. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Owen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Chairman Crenshaw and Ranking Member Serrano for including the Alexandria Bay Port Facility at $105 million. This really goes to the issue of jobs in my community, both the jobs to build this facility, but also the jobs that will be created by increasing Canadian tourism and Canadian trade. As you may know, Canada is along our northern border. We don't talk about it very often. It represents $1.3 trillion in commerce between these two countries. It is clearly our largest and best trading partner. It is someone who we rely on for security. It is also someone who has stood by us under every circumstance. So I thank you very much. My constituents thank you. And I hope that the discussion today focuses on jobs and job creation. Thank you.
Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me express my appreciation to our chair and ranking member, Mr. Serrano, for including important language in this report to help protect our historic post offices. As many of you may recall, Ranking Member Serrano and I worked last year to include language requesting a report from the American Council on Historic Preservation regarding the Postal Service's disposal of historic buildings. That report, released in April, along with the accompanying report by the USPS Office of Inspector General, found that the Postal Service's process for disposal of historic properties to be severely lacking and out of compliance with Section 106 of the Historic Preservation Act. Unfortunately, the response from the Postal Service has really been very disappointing. So I'm pleased that this bill contains strong language to suspend the sale of historic post offices until USPS implements the recommendations of these reports. Additionally, the language outlines critical public noticing procedures to ensure that communities and members of Congress are fully informed when the USPS seeks to sell a historic structure. Now, in my home district, for example, but I know throughout the country, in my district, people have been rightfully outspoken and dismayed by the manner in which the USPS sought to sell the downtown Berkeley post office built in 1914. Across the nation, post offices house more than 1,400 New Deal murals and sculptures. 998 postal buildings are listed under the National Historic Register. And so we need to ensure that the Postal Service follows guidance to preserve these national treasures. So I want to thank my colleagues again for this. Finally, let me just say the District of Columbia riders, they fly really in the face of the Home Rule Act passed in 1973. This allows for self-governance. These riders are fundamentally anti-democratic. They're really a slap in the face to D.C. residents. And I tell you, the will of members of Congress who do not represent the residents of the District of Columbia, for the life of me, I just can't imagine why we continue to impose the will of these members who don't represent these residents. And so I would hope, and when these riders, when we talk about them, I'll talk a little bit more about it, but I would just hope we would really reconsider and what these riders mean just in terms of our democracy and what they would mean for your district if, in fact, they were attacking and putting forth, requirements for your constituents. Thank you again.
There being no further discussion, are there amendments?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Crenshaw. In the bill on page.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentleman's recognized 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this is a manager's amendment. It includes a handful of technical and non-controversial items that have been agreed to by the minority. One item of note is that this amendment includes language that prohibits the IRS from destroying records in contravention of the Federal Records Act. And I want to thank Mr. Stewart for his work on this issue, and I ask that all members support this bipartisan amendment.
Mr. Serrano.
Mr. Chairman, I support the manager's amendment, and I appreciate the chairman's inclusion of items for Democratic members. In particular, I would like to thank the chairman for language involving the treatment of federal retirees in the territories, and I urge a yes vote on the amendment.
Further discussion. Mrs. Pingree.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to rise in support of the manager's amendment, thank the chair and the ranking member for including language expressing the committee's concern about the Tax and Trade Bureau's ability to maintain efficient operations during a time of exponential growth for the beer, wine, and distilled spirits industry it regulates. Now, I know this isn't the most compelling issue that we will take up today, but I do want to say that there was one bright spot during the Great Recession, and that was the robust growth in our craft brewing and distilling industries. According to the Bureau's own figures, there we go, in the last 5 years, wineries have grown by 40%, the brewery industry has grown by 98%, and the distilled spirits industry has grown by 107%. Now, the reason I'm interested in this is because this has had a huge impact on my home state of Maine. Our state now ranks 5th in the Brewers Association per capita craft brewery rankings, and in 2013 alone, 8 new craft breweries and 4 new craft distilleries opened for business in Maine. That brings us to 51 breweries, 12 distilleries in a state of just over 1 million people. Now, over that time, the Bureau has been operating with reduced or flat funding. The Bureau plays a key role in consumer protection by ensuring the integrity of alcohol products. And the report language included in the manager's amendment reflects the committee's appreciation of the Bureau's efforts to meet these increased demands. Now, I do want to say that many of us here on the committee are members of the Small Brewers Caucus. And I truly believe you're not members to get to the beer reception every year. I think you're there because you appreciate the economic benefit of craft breweries and the impact they have provided in our home states over the last 5 years. The committee's recognition of the need for flexibility at the Bureau will hopefully lead to a small step towards increased efficiencies in the regulation of these fast-growing industries in the years to come. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Is there further discussion? Mr. Fattah?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Chairman Crenshaw and Ranking Member Serrano for accommodating a request I had for the Manager's Amendment that would have a review done to look at what we can do to improve the opportunities for women and minority-owned small businesses that interact with the General Services Administration. So I thank you for your support in that regard, and I yield back.
Mr. Stewart.
I'd like to thank the chairman and the subcommittee chairman as well. And adhering to your counsel, Mr. Chairman, I will be brief, but I feel like there's a few points that are worth making. And one of them is to draw attention to the section within the manager's amendment that I think many of us are interested in. Is it as much as I would have requested, and if I were a king of the world, it's not. But it's a meaningful step forward, and so for that, I am grateful to the leadership for that. And very briefly, I don't think that anyone can look at the behavior of some individuals within the IRS and not be outraged. And we should be outraged. And many of us should be frightened. There's absolutely no question that there was a concerted and a coordinated effort to target conservative groups. 83% of the 298 applicants that were put on hold by the IRS were conservative organizations. 89% of those groups who were asked to reveal their donor list, which was not only inappropriate but illegal. 89% of those were right-leaning groups. There's a reason that Ms. Lerner took the Fifth. And now we have lost emails, which is the point of this section 630 that we address. We have crashed computers, we have recycled hard drives, recycled backup tapes, 6 other crashed computers, all of them from individuals within this pool that had that were part of this effort to target these conservative groups. I defy anyone on the other side or from my side that if we reversed roles on this, if President Bush had targeted progressive organizations and then had responded in this way, that they would not share in our concern. And once again, Section 630, it's not perfect, but it's a meaningful step forward. It makes it less likely and it makes it more difficult for the IRS to be vague and non-responsive and more difficult for them not to provide the backup information that we're requesting. And so for that reason, Mr. Crenshaw, thank you for working with me on this, and we would strongly support the manager's amendment. With that, I yield back.
Is there further discussion? If not, the chairman is recognized to close.
I move the amendment.
The question is on the manager's amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Mr. Serrano. Clerk will read.
Which one? Which one? Which one?
Which one?
Number one. Amendment offered by Mr. Serrano. Page 92, line 3, insert after the colon the
Without
following.
objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Mr. Latham and I are offering this amendment, which would restore language requiring the Postal Service to maintain 6-day delivery. For the first time since 1983, this subcommittee did not include the requirement that 6-day delivery be maintained. There has been bipartisan support in this committee and this Congress for 6-day delivery. So I'm hoping that both my Republican and Democratic colleagues will join in supporting this amendment today. The elimination of Saturday delivery would cause a great hardship to many Americans, but especially low-income Americans, the elderly, and those who live in rural areas. Many Americans depend upon 6-day delivery for vital services in a timely manner, including the delivery of prescriptions, Social Security checks, and other important items. Additionally, eliminating 6-day delivery is a job killer. If 6-day delivery is eliminated, our economy would lose 80,000 full and part-time jobs. Many of the jobs that will be lost are jobs held by veterans who make up 17.5% of the workforce. Eliminating Saturday mail delivery is a penny-wise and pound-foolish mistake that we're making. Many estimate that getting rid of six-day delivery would actually result in a loss of revenue that outweighs the projected savings. There is bipartisan support to continue six-day deliveries. The majority of the House has co-sponsored the bipartisan Graves-Connolly resolution expressing the sense of the House that the Postal Service should take all appropriate measures to ensure the continuation of six-day mail delivery service. Given this level of support, I would hope that this amendment would not be controversial and would receive bipartisan support. In closing, let me just say that I want to thank Mr. Latham for his help on this bill, on this amendment, and to say that we all know and understand that there are serious issues with the Postal Service. But what we need is an overhaul of the system, especially the way they deal with their payments and their health care and so on. What we don't need is to nip away at very important parts of the Postal Service, such as six-day delivery. So I would hope that we can all support this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I said in my opening statement, the reason that we included the language that we did that eliminates Saturday delivery is because the Postal Service is in a financial crisis. As I said earlier, that CBO estimates it would save $1.2 billion this next year, would save $13 billion over the next decade. And 80% of the American people think that the Postal Service's plan to deliver on Saturday is a good idea. But I know this is it's a tough decision for a lot of you. I'm going to vote no on the amendment, but I would encourage you simply to vote your conscience. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Laura.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of Mr. Serrano and Mr. Latham's amendment maintaining the six-day delivery by the U.S. Postal Service. As it's been stated, this would put thousands of Americans out of work, step backward for the Postal Service when we should move forward. Small businesses, many of which do business 7 days a week, working families, seniors who rely on timely delivery of Social Security checks. They should not have to spend long weekends waiting for the money that they need. We cannot give up on the competitive advantages that the Postal Service has over companies like UPS and FedEx. Instead of stopping Saturday service and ending jobs all over the country, what we need to be doing is to support our postal workers, revise the pre-funding rule that is causing so many of the financial problems at USPS. Because of a law that was passed in 2006, the Postal Service is the only enterprise in the country required to pre-fund retiree benefits. This cost the Postal Service approximately $5.6 billion a year for 10 years. I don't really care if it's FedEx, UPS, Facebook, Apple, Exxon, GE, having to pre-fund 80% of a 75-year liability in 10 years would put a strain on any company's resources. Because of the pre-funding, the Post Office was overcharged by as much as $75 billion by the Civil Service retirement system. If it doesn't have to pay into this fund every year, it would have experienced no operating losses until 2009. We all know that the Postal Service is facing financial constraints, and they are trying a number of things to save money, but ending Saturday service is not the answer. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment and restore the funds. Instead of hamstringing the Post Office, I hope that we can start focusing on what the real issue is, and that's dealing with the pre-funding requirement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Latham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to rise in support, obviously, with Mr. Serrano and his leadership on this amendment. For rural America, this is a really big issue as far as the lifeline we have to the rest of the business communities as far as getting timely payments, all of those things. The chairman mentioned that there's supposedly CBO says some savings, but there are no savings in this bill because of this provision. So it's not it doesn't affect what's available for spending in the bill. Also, I would just say that I think the fact that you're going to have at least a 2-day delay in delivery of first class is probably going to cause the hurried demise of the Postal Service in the long run. But people will find other alternatives if, in fact, they know that there's going to be a delay in first class. So I just rise in support, and I thank Mr. Serrano for his leadership.
Ms. Kaptur.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the Serrano amendment, and maybe I should put on the record, I actually was a letter carrier, even passed the postal truck driving test. So I have a vested interest in the success of the Postal Service. And probably the reason I got into politics, I knew how to do door-to-door. But let me just say that I can't think of a great nation around the world that doesn't have universal service and an efficient way of moving boxes and letters door to door. I think the problem with the Postal Service is they've had their Board of Governors heads in the sand and haven't allowed them to modernize at the same time as technology moved forward. They were handcuffed. The answer to the Postal Service's future is to allow them to offer more services, more advanced services, even financial services, and I can give you plenty of ideas how to do that, not require them to pre-fund health benefits 10 years down the road. And this has really been crippling to the Postal Service. I think the American people have enough upset in their lives right now. We know that if six-day delivery is eliminated, there would be over 50,000 rural letter carriers immediately put out of work. Mr. Latham has spoken on their behalf, but I can tell you the city letter carrier workforce has been reduced by 7% as well. And so literally hundreds of thousands of people have been impacted already, falling into the ranks of the unemployed. Some of them went on retirement, but we've shrunk the Postal Service. You've seen it in your own communities. When part-time carriers come to the door, they don't know the neighborhoods as well. And I just want to say something. You know, think about your own community. With large numbers of postal workers being veterans, there's a kind of security that comes from someone who is entrusted with the mail or boxes that come to you, and you kind of get to know that person. It gives you a sense of place where you live, whether it's rural or urban America. There's a kind of feeling about the country. It binds us all together. The Postal Service has a goodwill brand that belongs to every American. And to try to cripple that, I think, again, hurts our country so very, very much. It obviously threatens service all over this country in rural areas, but also in urban areas. When they start switching around people who don't have the same neighborhood every day, it creates another one of these moments where I think it creates a ripple that the American people don't need right now of uncertainty about who that person is. Do they know the neighborhood? If you see what's going on with all these cuts that have happened within the Postal Service, letters are being driven hundreds of miles away to be sorted, and then they come back. There are certain inefficiencies coming from the fact that we haven't allowed the Postal Service to modernize as quickly as it should. Through rain, sleet, and snow, Postal Service employees deliver more mail every day per capita than most countries deliver in a month. And I remember seeing a statistic that just with UPS and FedEx, which I use too, they mainly do boxes. They don't do all the other things that the Postal Service does. I think the Postal Service in one day or 1 week delivers as much as those two organizations do in an entire year. So the volume is so huge for the Postal Service, and it's dependable. So I rise in strong support of the gentleman's amendment. America's a great country. Why don't we behave like it? Let's improve the service, not diminish it, to every single American. Universal service, not selective service. Allow the Postal Service to compete and modernize its services. Thank you.
Mr. Graves.
Well, that's my smarter friend over here from the South. I don't.
Oh, I'm
quite
sorry,
talk
Mr.
the
Yoder.
Raw, but thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to rise in support of the Serrano-Latham amendment. I believe that we do need postal reform, and certainly we've got to figure out a way to deliver our products cheaper in this country when it comes to the Postal Service. We've got to figure out how to produce a better product for less money. That's what the business community does. That's what our committee should be focused on is how we produce even better services for our constituents while spending less money to get there, making the Postal Service more efficient. What this amendment seeks to do is restore a provision in this legislation that I think would go the opposite direction. Eliminating 6-day delivery would simply reduce a service to our constituents. I don't believe the savings would materialize in the way we would want them to, and so we'd be essentially giving people less service, and they'd still be paying the same amount for stamps. We'd still be expending nearly the same amount, I think, in our budget. And so I don't think this gets us where we need to go, but I do think as a committee we need to look strongly or more strongly at Postal Service reform. I'll also say I have a grandmother who turns 103 on Saturday, and I want to make sure she gets the birthday card from me. Yeah, come on, hey, if that doesn't pull your heartstrings. And I will tell you, the best part of her day is when she gets her mail, right? So come on, people. Listen, I support the amendment. I think it's the right thing to do, and I hope that as a committee we can come together and support it.
Chair apologizes to the gentleman for calling him a different name.
You might apologize to Mr. Graves, really,
yeah.
Mr. Chairman.
Especially a UK Wildcats basketball fan who had the good sense to marry a Kentucky woman.
That is true. Married up, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be very brief. I want to add my voice in support of the Serrano amendment and underscore something that a couple of the other members have also emphasized, and that is the fundamental challenge facing the Postal Service, in addition to the changing nature of our communication in the electronic era, is the fact that we have imposed an unsustainable and enormous financial obligation to pre-fund their retirement. No agency could withstand that. And for those of us that are skeptical, it looks like an effort to starve the beast. We impose this requirement. We put the agency in desperate financial straits. Then we start closing down postal services and diminishing access to the Postal Service. We look at chipping away at 6-day delivery, and as Mr. Latham points out, people turn to alternatives, and before you know it, you've so degraded the quality of the service, you've merely compounded the problem. Less people are using the service, and ultimately cause the Postal Service to wither and die. I think that would be a great tragedy for the country, for the people that rely on it, for the people that work for the Postal Service. And I think if we have a more measured plan, a more measured pre-funding plan, we can achieve the fiscal standards we have set, but do so in a responsible way that doesn't effectively put an end to the Postal Service as we know it. And I would urge support for the amendment.
The Chair, in an effort to expedite matters, will signal 3 minutes, which gives you 2 to wind up if you have to have it. But 3 minutes will give you a 3-minute warning. Gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong support of this amendment, and for all the reasons that have already been highlighted. And I just wanted to point out, if we really want to help the Postal Service, there is a bill, H.R. 630, that would actually eliminate the USPS's unique and unfairly burdensome to with regards to its pre-funding requirement. As was mentioned, the Postal Service is the only organization, public and private, that is required by law to pre-fund such benefits. And if this requirement were not there, between 2007 and 2010, they would actually have had an operational profit. And during this fiscal year, as we're midway through it, USPS has already reported a $1 billion operating profit. But because of the fact that it is required to have this pre-funding of their benefits, at the end of this year, it will have to report a loss. So I encourage anybody that wants to help our post office to co-sponsor H.R. 630. It already has 189 co-sponsors. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Ms. McCullum.
As been pointed out by colleagues, this does not do anything to solve the U.S. Postal Service's fiscal challenges, but it will make the post office less competitive. And I have many small businesses that are open on Saturday and Sunday and not on Mondays. So for them, this means a severe decrease in the loss of available mail to them and puts them at a competitive disadvantage. Many of them feel that way in speaking with them. But the other thing that I'm starting to hear from people when we talk about cutting back the 6-day delivery service is in Minnesota, as in I'm sure many parts of the country, people through their HMOs and through their healthcare organizations are now receiving their prescription drugs by mail. And so I'm starting to hear, what does this mean? What if I'm going to go on vacation? You know, do I have to call? How's this going to work? How do I make sure that I receive my prescriptions on time? So that's something I think we need to keep in mind. But we pointed out that the U.S. Postal Service is a large employer. It's a large employer of veterans, folks. And as we're welcoming our veterans home, and we have, you know, done everything that we can through the public sector and the private sector to make sure that they have jobs that they can return home to and support their families, this provision in the bill actually would, in my opinion, be cutting jobs from veterans. So here's a fact. This has bipartisan support here. Mr. Graves' bill has bipartisan support with his resolution. And I think we should just save some time on the floor and vote for Mr. Serrano's amendment, with all due respect, Mr. Crenshaw.
Mr. Farr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My district office is in a post office, and I have to walk through the lines of people there. I can tell you that I don't think there's a federal service. People assume it's a federal service and don't think of it as an independent agency. But I don't think there's a federal service that's more popular than the post office. People love them. And they've got a historical character. And here we are spending most of our time trying to name post offices around the country after constituents. So, you know, it is a very important institution. We probably never spent this much time. But I think if you don't support this amendment, you're going to have a hard time going home and explaining why. We're cutting $575 million out of this, and for those that you like cut, squeeze, and trim, you can say, well, that's just part of it. But on the other hand, this is the same committee where we're cutting all these other bills. We put $4.1 billion in the Defense Department that they didn't ask for. So it's going to be very hard to say that we cut out the post offices because we had to pay for the Defense Department. I hope you'll support the amendment.
Ms. Wasserman-Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not going to take the 3 minutes and try not to repeat too much of everything that's been said, but we don't do a lot in this committee that, at least lately, that where there's bipartisan agreement. I think the most important points are, yes, the Postal Service is in significant dire financial straits. Those of us that support this amendment recognize that, but believe that there are other ways that are not going to reduce the access and the connectivity and the lifeline that 6-day mail provides to seniors, to those in rural communities, to those with broadband access issues. I'll tell you, as probably not going to come as a surprise, as a representative from the state of Florida, with you know, among the highest populations of senior citizens in the country, they are not all connected online, and many of them rely on that mail that they get 6 days a week as a lifeline. They also rely on a visit from the letter carrier so that they maintain some in-person relationships. In some cases, there are seniors who the only person they see all day is their letter carrier. So 6-day mail is more than just, you know, access to information. It's a lifeline, and keeping it in place is an American tradition and one that I think is incredibly important, and I support the amendment.
Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me also rise and thank Mr. Serrano for this amendment, and just want to say a couple of things. First of all, everyone has talked about the importance of 6-day mail delivery, and I want to reference the issue, first of all, around jobs in addition to veterans. The Postal Service has provided really probably the primary pathway into the middle class for people of color, especially for African Americans. My grandfather delivered mail. I've seen pictures of him on horseback delivering mail in El Paso, Texas. He was the first African-American letter carrier in El Paso, Texas. He spoke fluent Spanish. He had a degree from Houston-Tillotson College. And I tell you one thing, that as a child, I would run to the mailbox every month to pick up his retirement check. That retirement check and his work as a letter carrier for 35 years really provided my family, my extended family, the really means to purchase a home and to move into the middle class. It was the mail service, the postal service, which to this day provides those jobs for African Americans who really want a shot at the American dream. And this 6-day service is so critical for communities of color, not only in terms of the mail delivery, but also the jobs and the economic security that the mail service and the postal service provides. Also, let me say that my mother lives in assisted living, and you know, going to the issue around seniors, oftentimes, and most of the time, really, many seniors see this as the highlight of their day, going, talking to their letter carrier, waiting for the mail to be delivered, walking down to that post office, to their little box in the lobby on Saturday. They need this in addition for the prescriptions and for their mail, because now a lot of them have access to computers. They need this for that social interaction, and they need this because they need their mail, and they need to know what's going on. They need to hear from their families. They need their prescriptions. And so I would urge us to support this amendment. It's in many ways personal for a lot of us, but especially in the African American community. We really recognize and honor the Postal Service because it has really been the primary means for economic security for many in our community. Thank you again.
Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me associate myself with all of my colleagues who have spoken in support of this amendment. I think 6-day mail delivery is really American, and it's necessary for so many segments of our population. I represent a rural area, and of course it's essential in our rural areas. But I want to speak particularly wearing my hat as ranking member of the Subcommittee of Military Construction and Veterans Affairs. Many of our veterans, and we have all agonized over the problems of veterans getting access to medical care, but many of our veterans receive their medications by mail, and they often are anxious because when they run out of the medication and they have not received it, they are constantly going to the mailbox wanting to receive this life-saving medication. I would urge my colleagues to consider the impact that this will have on veterans, particularly veterans in rural areas, who get their medications that are life-sustaining through the mail. And if it came on Saturday, that would be a lot better if, rather than having to wait from Friday till Monday to have it received. So I would urge my colleagues, in behalf of our nation's veterans who have really paid the price for the freedoms that we enjoy, to please adopt this amendment, continue 6-day delivery so that our veterans will at least have access to their medications that are delivered largely by mail. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Adderholt.
I'll be very brief, probably less than 60 seconds. I just want to rise in support also of the Serrano-Latham amendment. It was pointed out to me that if 6-day delivery is reduced to 5 days a week, then mail will actually only be delivered 4 days a week, 20% of the year due to holidays. For residents that are elderly, and especially for rural areas, that's a real problem. This is not a luxury. Also, I think we have to bear in mind that should we have some type of cyber attack in some part of the country, we always have the mail delivery to back up to, which I think is very important. And so, again, I strongly support this amendment, and want to thank Mr. Serrano and Mr. Latham for their bringing this amendment to our attention. Thank you.
Mr. Fattah.
Mr. Chairman, I previously served as the ranking member on postal affairs a long time ago in this Congress. This nation has the finest postal service anywhere in the world. It's not comparable. 90+% of the mail is delivered overnight, first-class mail to the location. We, as a nation, should not be taking a step backwards. We're not trying to become a second-rate nation. Postal Service is an integral part of our economy and our interactions as citizens, and so we should support this amendment, and we should also, since postal activities and the Appropriations Committee share mention in the Constitution, we should rush to this, Mr. Chairman, so I'll yield back.
Mr. Owen.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of this amendment. I would offer only one new piece of information, and that is this is a service that is constitutionally required. Thank you.
Mr. Serrano is recognized to close.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Pastor.
I want to remind our colleagues that Chairman Latham and I next year will be waiting for our retirement checks along with some of the committee. 6-day delivery is going to be very important. So give us a break. Vote for the amendment. Support the amendment.
Mr. Serrano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, I think there's no way to follow that. But there's certainly bipartisan support for this, and I hope we can restore this. It's been around since 1983. In fact, I was wondering if Ms. Roybal Allard's father was the one who inserted the provision in the first place to begin with a long time ago when he was chairman of the committee. But it's something that you've heard from everybody on, and I would just hope that we pass it and pass it unanimously. Thank you.
Question is on the Serrano amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. No. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there other amendments? Mr. Yoder. Clerk will read.
Which amendment?
Which one?
Amendment offered by Mr. Yoder.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment we addressed last year in this committee on this bill as well. This amendment deals with the privacy of our digital correspondence and stored information in this country. We all remember the NSA situation, and we're still uncovering and going through how we examine what the NSA is doing to our private information. Much of that dealt with metadata. The big issue there was partly phone records of Americans that the federal government was containing. This issue, frankly, that we're addressing here is much more egregious abuse of our civil liberties and more egregious abuse of the Constitution. Many of our civil agencies, such as the SEC, the IRS, Department of Justice, and other agencies, are using a 1986 law that is out of date and out of touch with the ways Americans store and communicate today. This 1986 law essentially says that when information is stored over 180 days on any type of server, it is considered abandoned by the user and therefore searchable and seizable by the federal government without a warrant, without due process, without probable cause. There is a bill going through Congress. It's called the Email Privacy Act. It has 220 co-sponsors. Many in this committee are co-sponsors. It's a bipartisan bill. One of my co-sponsors is Jared Polis. The other one's Tom Graves. And so we certainly have support all across the conference. And what this amendment would do would be to prohibit funding for searches and seizures of digital correspondence without following the normal warrant procedures that we'd use for paper correspondence. Probably one of the most frustrating responses regarding this issue when it was raised in the last year was the IRS's position that they had previously held, and I don't know that they hold it today, but who knows what goes on over there half the time. The IRS's position was that Americans have no expectation of privacy when it comes to their email accounts. Well, frankly, I disagree, and I think many of you disagree, and I think most of your constituents would disagree. Americans do expect that when they correspond to one another, that digital correspondence is treated just like paper correspondence, just like mail that goes through the Postal Service 6 days a week. So this amendment would prohibit funding for utilizing that 1986 law in a way in which it would violate Americans' Fourth Amendment rights. It would require that the Fourth Amendment be followed, that a warrant be utilized to examine stored information. This is not only an issue for our constituents, not only an issue for the individual liberty and privacy of our constituents, it's also an American business issue. I had a chance to visit with many of our technology companies and some of their CEOs that store lots of information. They're telling me some of the main questions they get when they're overseas or when they're dealing with foreign investors or foreign individuals is, if I store my information on Google or on Dropbox or one of your companies, does that information then become searchable and seizable by the federal government? Because if so, I don't want to store information with American companies. They say they don't want to use domestic technology companies. This is going to be a jobs issue. It's a Fourth Amendment issue for sure, and it's one that I think we can come together on as a Congress and fix this session with legislation. But this amendment would prohibit funding with the entities that are in financial services if we can't get that bill actually passed. It's supported by the Heritage Foundation, the ACLU. I mean, we're bringing the world together with this legislation. And so I hope that this committee could support this as we did last year. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd yield back the balance of my time.
Chairman Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of this amendment. I want to thank Mr. Yoder for his hard work on this issue. I think most of us believe that the agencies funded in this bill should not be able to look at Americans' old emails without a court order. So I urge the adoption of this amendment.
Mr. Serrano.
The love fest continues. I rise in support of the gentleman's amendment. I'm glad my primary was yesterday and not tomorrow by saying that. I'm only kidding. This amendment bars agencies government-wide from accessing private electronic communications held by third parties unless the appropriate constitutional standard is met, a warrant based on probable cause. And I just want to briefly say that the reason that this has bipartisan support is because, in spite of what some people may think, we on both sides do not like this kind of behavior, and we feel that constitutionally we have the right to privacy. And so rather than go through all the various points that the chairman, that the gentleman has made about his amendment, I support it. I hope we support it in a bipartisan fashion, and I hope that we send a message with it that, notwithstanding what some people think, we all in this House value our privacy and value our Constitution and value the proper behavior in dealing with these issues. And I yield back.
Mr. Fattah.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in enthusiastic support of my colleague's amendment, and I'm also a co-sponsor of the principal legislation that he referred to. I think this is extraordinarily important that we draw a line. It has nothing to do with political philosophies or anything of the sort. It goes to the constitutional protections that we have as in terms of privacy and due process. So I strongly encourage the committee to adopt the amendment.
If there's no further debate, Mr. Yoder is recognized to close.
I want to thank my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and my colleagues here as well, and the chairman for their enthusiastic support. This is an issue I think we need to get accomplished this session. If you haven't signed on to the underlying bill, just to put in a plug, Mr. Chairman, H.R. 1852, we'd love to get your co-sponsorship. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Question is on the Yoder amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Mr. Serrano.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Serrano.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with.
The bill currently provides $300 million less for the SEC than the administration has asked for in FY 2015, and it prohibits the SEC from using the reserve fund established by Dodd-Frank for mission-critical IT needs, which is, in effect, another $70 million reduction in funding. At the proposed funding level, the SEC would have to reduce its current staff at the very time they need to be hiring new experts to help protect investors and to fully implement all of the rules and responsibilities required by Dodd-Frank. Our nation is still feeling the effects of the complex financial schemes that led to the 2008 financial meltdown. The reforms in Dodd-Frank are already helping prevent future problems, but the SEC needs adequate funding to carry them out. By limiting SEC funding, we are preventing the agency from keeping up with market changes. Many financial firms spend more on their IT budgets than the SEC spends in its entire budget, and pressing new problems are appearing every day. We should be doing everything possible to lower this discrepancy, and it starts with giving the SEC the resources they need to protect American investors and to prevent fraud, abuse, and mismanagement at corporations. My amendment would increase funding for the Securities and Exchange Commission by $300 million, which would fund the SEC at the level requested by the administration. I'm not seeking to withdraw the restriction on the reserve fund because I do not have a $70 million offset, even though I know we do not have to have one at full committee. I want to be clear that funding the SEC at this level is perfectly feasible if this committee had the will. According to CBO, since we do not touch the reserve fund, this increase will not have any impact on the 302B allocation because the SEC is fee-funded. We need a strong cop on the beat to prevent past abuses from being repeated. This amendment would help do that, and I urge its adoption. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to this amendment. I want you to know the committee is not starving the SEC for funds. Let me give you a couple of facts and figures. In 2011, the SEC received a 7% increase. They received a 12% increase in fiscal year 2012. And in fiscal year 2014, they received a 7.5% increase over the sequester level. And now this year, the SEC is asking for $350 million more than they got last year. Now that's a 21% increase over fiscal year 2014. For fiscal year 2015, we've recommended a $1.4 billion, which is actually $50 million above 2014. And we zero the money in on critical areas like information technology. Here's something you might be interested in knowing. Since 2001, we've increased the SEC's funding level by more than 200%. 200%. Now, there are not many federal agencies who can say they have received that kind of increase that the SEC has. And what did the investors get from the SEC as a result of this increased funding? Well, the Commission missed the Madoff scandal. They had a no-bid lease debacle for almost 1 million square feet of office space that wasn't needed. They had trouble producing accurate financial statements. They have not done a serious and thorough review of the agency's bureaucratic and siloed structure in order to become more efficient and more effective. They wasted over $1 million on unnecessary equipment, and some of the Commission's rules have been thrown out in court due to the lack of economic analysis. So that's just to name a few of the embarrassing lapses in the SEC enforcement and management. So this is not about lack of funding. Throwing more money at the SEC is not the answer. We believe that the Commission needs to get back on track, show real progress before we give them hundreds of millions of dollars more. The bill has targeted extra funding in areas of need within the Commission: information technology and economic analysis. That's what we're trying to help them with. So the last 3 years, the committee has supported the SEC's information technology funding. By upgrading their information technology systems, they'll be able to better leverage its own resources to catch the bad actors, to provide the quality review that security filings demand. So once again, the SEC is not starved for resources. We can't buy a better regulator, and I urge a no vote on this amendment.
Is there further discussion? Mr. Serrano is recognized to close.
In all the years I've been in public office, I never had an agency come before me, as the SEC did during the years when it refused to do some of the work it had to do. And I remember them telling me that they didn't need any more money. We then saw in 2008 what that meant. Now, throughout the last couple of years, we've, in a bipartisan fashion, have asked them to take on a larger workload, to take on a much more important role, and to be the cop on the beat that makes sure that what happens in 2008 does not repeat itself. This is not about throwing money at any agency. This is not about throwing money away. This is about saying we have a couple of things in this country we've done differently, and one of them is we tried to fix the mess that was created in 2008 by Wall Street, not by us, not by anyone else. It's the SEC that has to look after that. It's the SEC that has to enforce that, and that's why we need this funding, and I would hope that we can vote for this amendment.
Question is on the Serrano amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed will say no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman?
Show of hands is abundantly clear. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop? Yes. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert? Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw? Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar? Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson? Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro? Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent? Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr? Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah? Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen? Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger? Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Herrera-Butler? Ms. Herrera-Butler, no. Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter? Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kingston? Mr. Kingston, no. Mr. Latham? Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy?
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCollum? Ms. McCollum, aye. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunnally? Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens, aye. Mr. Pastor? Mr. Pastor, aye. Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Roby-Allard? Ms. Roby-Allard, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky? Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz? Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, aye. Mr. Wolf? Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded? Mr. Latham?
Gentleman is not recorded. Mr. Latham, no.
Members wish to change their vote? Mr. Simpson? No.
Mr. Simpson, no.
Clerk will tally.
Mr. Chairman, while the clerk is tallying, I just would like to make an inquiry. You talked at the outset about we've done 10 bills in regular order. I was just curious as to the disposition of the labor HHS bill and when we thought we might be able to get that bill up. I know there's that, and I think Interior, but there's a ranking member concerned about that bill.
Like all the other bills, it's in process.
Mm-hmm. Are we thinking about when we get back after the break, or?
My goal is to pass all the bills through the committee by the August recess.
So, but we don't have a specific time for the bill yet.
I don't have the calendar before me, but it'll be done before the break.
Okay, thank you very much.
On this vote, the yeas are 22, the nays are 28. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Harris.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk designated Harris number 2.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Harris, page 1.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, before I came to the Congress, I did my research was on fetal brain physiology.
Say again.
Fetal brain physiology, the brains and the development of fetal brains in utero. And I'll tell you, there are areas of brain physiology, including fetal physiology, that we know very little about still. In fact, I would say that the brain physiology and knowledge is actually one of the last frontiers, not of medical knowledge, but of medical ignorance. But there are some things we do know, and one of the things we do know is that marijuana use is dangerous to the developing brain. It's not controversial anymore. It is dangerous to the developing brain, and I'll go through some of the evidence. My amendment before you today would simply say, would restore the pre-2007 language to the areas, the limitation amendment that dealt with the ability of the District of Columbia to decriminalize or legalize marijuana. And it would say that, in fact, the decriminalization bill, which I'll get into a little bit, some of the aspects of it, and the hazards to children, cannot be implemented. It'll go into effect because we don't have jurisdiction of that, but we can prevent implementation through the limitation amendment. And it's not a jurisdictional issue. We know we have the jurisdiction. Whether we use it or not, we can debate, but we have the jurisdiction to do it. Now, look, I can spend a lot of time. I can read from DEA studies or papers May 2014, just last month issued. I urge all the members read about this and what the effect of marijuana is on developing brains. And I'm going to concentrate on that because, you know, maybe what you do when you're 30 or 40, I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about what you do when you're 12 and 13 and 14 and 15 and how it's clear that using marijuana, the 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old has structural changes in the brain that just plain aren't good. You know, but it goes beyond that. National Institute of Drug Abuse. Read their testimony. Go to their website. And this is not about medical marijuana. This is about decriminalization, recreational use. Go to their website, see what they say about what marijuana does. You know, I visit employers in my district. They're worried about what the effect in Maryland of decriminalization in Maryland will do to the workforce. We pride ourselves. We have a skilled workforce. Think those skills get better when you're intoxicated with marijuana? Don't think so. ER visits gone up nationally. We know that. Facts and figures, ER visits gone up, linked to marijuana use. Auto accidents linked to marijuana use goes up. We have no practical way to measure that, by the way. Someone intoxicated under marijuana, you know, there's no breathalyzer for marijuana. So it's actually hard to even enforce that. You know, some opponents of my measure will say, well, Maryland has decriminalization. What are you doing here doing this? Let's walk through the bill, though. Do you know how D.C. decriminalized it? They put a $25 fine on it. Whether you're 12 or 40, the fine is $25. In fact, if you're 12 and possess a cigarette, the fine is $50 in D.C. But they decided that a 12-year-old possessing marijuana has a $25 fine. In Maryland, it's $100, and it's a referral for help. You see, in D.C., it's $25, whether it's the first, second, third, or 50th violation, with no referral for help. Not even a 14 or 15-year-old. That's just plain bad policy. This is the opportunity to stop that bad policy from going forward, because we have to take that into consideration. Now, I would offer that if anyone thinks that proceeding with implementation of that bill will decrease the number of youth using marijuana in D.C., will decrease it, then vote against the amendment, because I am for decreasing the amount of drugs from youth. If anyone thinks that use of other drugs by children will go down by passing this amendment, then please vote against this amendment. But the evidence is quite clear that when children use marijuana, they go on to use other drugs. Not all of them, of course not all of them, but an increasing number. That's not fair. That's not fair to do to our children. Look, no one should vote for this amendment because they think their popularity or their polling is going to go up in their district. Probably won't. I'm going to ask you to vote for this amendment because it's the right thing to do because of the way underage individuals are treated in that law, and because the use of marijuana, the use of other drugs will go up in D.C., and it will harm them. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Chairman Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just rise in support of this amendment. I think it's been pointed out marijuana is a dangerous drug, and so I urge a yes vote.
Mr. Serrano.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong opposition to the amendment. Until each member of this body is willing to have Congress dictate the use of their district's local funds, I maintain that it is unfair for any of us to tell the District of Columbia how to use its locally derived revenue. And let's be honest about this, and let's understand that. Every time you see one of these riders, it's about being for an issue, but not back home, actually imposing it on D.C. That's been the story of this committee and these riders for a long time. The provision in this bill that has been carried for years allows no federal funds to be spent on decriminalization. This extends that to exert congressional control over what D.C. can do with its own funds and its own laws. I sincerely doubt that any of the members of this body would wish that level of congressional control over local finances and laws. The District of Columbia is no different. Enforcement of D.C.'s marijuana decriminalization law would be no different than enforcement in any other jurisdiction that has decriminalized marijuana. I think that local elected officials and law enforcement organizations are more than capable of deciding what local criminal law should be. I would also note, in case there is some confusion, that there is a big difference between decriminalization and legalization. The D.C.'s recently passed law would simply decriminalize possession of small amounts of marijuana, imposing civil fines instead of jail time. It does not legalize marijuana, nor does it legalize drug trafficking in marijuana. Given the disproportionate impact that our criminal justice system laws have on minority communities, that does not seem unreasonable to me, and it certainly seems like a decision that should be up to the local government, not the Appropriations Committee. If the member offering this amendment, with all due respect, is so interested in D.C. local affairs, then I would urge that he follow former Chairman Obie's advice and run for the District of Columbia City Council. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, rise in opposition to this amendment. I don't argue that marijuana can have adverse impacts on the developing brain, as does alcohol. I'm sure the gentleman from Maryland is familiar with alcohol-fetal syndrome. But he's not willing to take on the alcohol lobby, nor his constituents, who would not let him get away with that. And I'm not sure his constituents in Eastern Maryland would want him even imposing this on his part of Maryland when it's different treatment than the rest of Maryland. And here we have duly elected, democratically elected people who have discussed, debated, and concluded that this is the right thing. So let me tell you why the representatives of the District of Columbia made this determination. First of all, as Mr. Serrano says, it's not decriminalization. Still criminal act, but they said that if you are an adult with less than an ounce of marijuana in your possession privately, then it is a relatively small fine. But if you're publicly using marijuana, you can get 2 months in jail and a more substantial fine. Currently, even if you're using marijuana privately, you can get put in jail for 6 months and a $1,000 fine. But this is not like Colorado and Washington, where it's been decriminalized. It's still a criminal act. But Washington, D.C. has the highest arrest rate for marijuana possession in the nation. And 91% of those arrests are African Americans. African Americans are 8 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than whites, even though whites use marijuana at the same rate. Now, D.C. decided that its law enforcement resources were not being used most effectively. Marijuana possession was about half of all of the drug offenses. It was costing more than $26 million a year. So the residents of D.C. decided this is not a good use of our limited resources. And it seems to me that that's their decision. That's their decision. What's right for them, what's right for D.C. may not be considered the same as what's right for the Eastern Shore of Maryland. I know the gentleman would agree there's different perceptions, different philosophies, different ideologies, different communities. And that's what makes our country great, those kinds of differences. It just doesn't seem right that the Eastern Shore of Maryland should be able to reach over into D.C. and make laws for D.C. It's not the way this country is supposed to function. So, Mr. Chairman, this amendment should be rejected on a number of grounds, primarily because the D.C. voters, elected people, they made a decision, and it seems to me we ought to respect that decision And this does not decriminalize marijuana, but uses the law enforcement resources of D.C. in a much more effective manner. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes itself. Would the gentleman from Maryland respond to a question? You may have covered this in your presentation, I'm not sure. What is the scientific evidence of the impact on unborn children's brain,
Sure.
or otherwise, from the mother's use of marijuana?
I'll answer that briefly, and I didn't cover it because, this is a big book, study after study. But let me tell you the one that dealt very specifically with this. A study by researchers at the Erasmus University Medical Center in Rotterdam, again, this is quoting from the DEA, Rotterdam, Netherlands, found women who smoke pot during pregnancy may impair their baby's growth and development in the womb. The babies born to marijuana users tended to weigh less and have smaller heads than other infants. There's only one thing inside a head. It's a brain. You have a smaller head, you have a smaller brain. So I will take issue with the gentleman from Virginia when he says that it can affect brains. No, sir, it does affect brains. And it affects brains in pregnancy, of the fetus, it affects brains in children, and it affects brains in adults. Thank you. And I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Is there, Mr. Farr?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It strikes me this is a historical day. Our ranking member here got elected, renominated last night. And the history, the news all over the papers is about all the people that got elected. Senate, House members, state legislatures, so on. Essentially, it was headlines about local control. We're a House of Representatives. We represent different states and districts within those states. And if you look at this debate we always get into when the District of Columbia funding comes up, we kind of forget how that local control created the District of Columbia. First it was with the permission of the state, whatever state, because they didn't know where it was going to be, to give up the land. And then it was that the role of Congress would be to govern the government that was created on that land. Not to govern every single thing, building permits, water permits, things like that, law enforcement, local law enforcement. They have a government here. And they're made up of elected officials just like us. And they go through these debates. This debate that we're having, this amendment has nothing to do with legalization or non-legalization of marijuana or anything else. It prohibits federal money from being spent in the district to allow them to regulate whatever rules they make. I mean, California went through this debate when I was in the legislature in the early 80s about decriminalizing marijuana because it was just law enforcement led the argument. We don't want to put all these kids in jail. We'd like to fine them if they're breaking the law, but not put them in jail. That's the debate they're having here at their city council level. It seems to me we have to, as appropriators, I mean, this particularly this marijuana issue, we had a big debate on the floor. We had 49 Republicans support getting the government out of those states that had gone through this local control decision-making of deciding how to legalize medical marijuana or otherwise. And we agreed that it was time to back off on that. You know, the one thing that's appalling in this, we have never authorized our FDA or any medical entity in this country to do a definitive study on marijuana. Jack Kingston and I were talking about it in the Ag Committee. We have control of FDA. We ought to have a hearing on it. Appropriators ought to lead this. Maybe we ought to just at least have a study to get all this, whether it's good or bad, out there. But the last thing we don't want to do is go to micromanage the City Council of Washington, D.C.
Jim and you.
Yes, sir.
Is the gentleman aware that there's overwhelming evidence that the use of marijuana is the gateway drug for young people to other drugs, like opioids and now heroin?
Well,
there's overwhelming evidence.
That's assuming, Mr. Chairman, I mean, you're a parent, I'm a parent, that's assuming that they're not trying anything else. No drinking, no anything. I think anything that's addictive can be a gateway to something else, worse. And not everybody who ever tries it ends up becoming addictive. There are issues of addictive behavior, and we ought to treat that. But just to micromanage this being a heavy parent for the city of Washington, D.C., I think is the wrong approach for this important Appropriations Committee. As I said, this amendment, read it. There's nothing in here about legalization or non-legalization. It just says none of the federal funds contained in this act may be used to enact or carry out any law. So I think it's time that we allow D.C. Council and the politics of this great city to decide those kinds of issues to themselves and stay out of it.
Ms. Lee?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong opposition to this amendment, and I would say that's really a surprise to see this amendment introduced so soon as, of course, the Republican-controlled House passed an amendment to the Commerce Justice State Science Bill to protect jurisdiction that legalizes medical marijuana from federal interference. We said we do not want the federal government interfering in those states that have passed their own initiatives. But I guess I shouldn't be surprised because, once again, this appropriations process is being used to pass really poison pill riders to score political points. Today we're seeing yet another attack on the District of Columbia's autonomy and the will of its voters and lawmakers. The D.C. Home Rule Act, passed in 1973, allows for self-governance. We must not forget that the district's marijuana legislation, as Congressman Moran mentioned earlier, it was passed in part to address the outrageous rates at which African American residents were arrested for marijuana-related crimes. Now, this is at the core of criminal justice reform, which Republicans and Democrats have indicated really need to happen. We need an overhaul of our criminal justice system, and this is a basic issue in that overhaul. Also, this amendment would create confusion for business owners who have invested in building companies, creating jobs, and paying taxes. This Congress has taken a bipartisan stand to say that the federal government should respect states' rights and the will of the voters when it comes to this issue. And I'm really troubled to see such an abuse of this process to legislate policy for the District of Columbia in this amendment. Once again, the residents of the District of Columbia have the intelligence, mind you, they have the intelligence to decide for themselves appropriate policies. It's not up to any of us who do not represent the district. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton is the district's respected representative here in this body. We are not. And so it's about time we stop trying to impose the will of members from all around the country on the residents of this district. The people of the District of Columbia deserve their autonomy, self-governance, and they don't deserve any of you meddling in their business.
There being no further discussion, Dr. Harris is recognized to close.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for the discussion. To clear up some things, first of all, Congress has the authority under Article 1, Section 8 to execute exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever. There is not a question whether we have the authority. It's a question whether it's the right thing to do. And to suggest that I'm going to be politically more popular because I want to stop decriminalization, even Delegate Norton's press release this morning suggests otherwise. This is not because it's the politically popular thing to do. It was poorly done, this law. $25 fine for children with no referral for treatment. That's not the way to do it. I urge adoption of the amendment.
The question is the Harris Amendment. All in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no.
No.
The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Roll call. So many as are in favor of a roll call, raise your hand. A sufficient number. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Aye. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Amadei. Yes. Mr. Amadei, aye. Mr. Bishop. Aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert. Aye. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter. Aye. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Crenshaw. Aye. Mr. Crenshaw, aye. Mr. Cuellar. Aye. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson. Aye. Mr. Culberson, aye. Ms. DeLauro. No. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Dent. Aye. Mr. Dent, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Farr. Mr. Farr, no. Mr. Fatah. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, aye. Mr. Feelinghuisen. Mr. Feelinghuisen, aye. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, aye. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, aye. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Ms. Herrera-Butler, aye. Mr. Honda. Mr. Honda, no. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter.
No.
Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kingston. Mr. Latham. Mr. Latham, aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, no. Mrs. Lowy.
No.
Mrs. Lowy, no. Ms. McCullum. Ms. McCullum, no. Mr. Moran.
No.
Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Nunnally. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens, no. Mr. Pastor. Mr. Pastor, no. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, no. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, no. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Rooney, aye. Ms. Robo-Allard. Ms. Robo-Allard, no. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan, no. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano, no. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, aye. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Mr. Visklosky. Mr. Visklosky, no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mr. Wolf. Mr. Wolf, aye. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, aye. Mr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder, aye.
Are there members who wish to be recorded? Mr. Fatah? Or to
Mr.
change?
Fatah, no.
Clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 28, the nays are 21. The amendment is agreed to. Ms. Lowy.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mrs. Lowy.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with.
The bill before us makes me doubt the old adage that there are three parties in Washington: Democrats, Republicans, and appropriators. That was such an important line, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to repeat it again, because I really did come to this Appropriation Committee believing there were Democrats, Republicans, and appropriators. We could avoid talk of culture wars and government shutdowns by passing a bill that protects financial consumer rights and focuses more strictly on rebuilding our economy. My amendment would remove 15 unnecessary policy riders included in this report and this bill. For example, this bill prohibits the Department of Treasury from finalizing any rules on the standards to evaluate 501c4 organizations, even though confusion in the standard helped create the IRS mess in the first place. Now I have to get to the next page. It would prohibit the IRS from implementing its part of the Affordable Care Act, even though it's providing millions of Americans with affordable health coverage for the first time and was passed by Congress, signed into law by the President, and upheld by the Supreme Court. And finally, my amendment would remove riders that aim to dictate onerous federal restrictions on Washington, D.C.'s local budgetary functions. We should not, my friends, limit the ability of Washington, D.C. to spend its own funds to protect the health and safety of its residents. Residents of Washington, D.C. risk their lives in our armed services. They work as Capitol Police that protect us while we work, and nearly all of us have Washington residents working on our staff. It is outrageous for us to deny the district funding for efforts to provide a voting right in Congress. That's just not consistent with the principles upon which our nation was founded. I would appreciate it if you would support my amendment, remove unnecessary policy riders. Let's get back to making an honest effort to write the best bills possible. Yield back.
Chairman Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in respectful opposition to this amendment because this amendment proposes to strike numerous provisions that we included in the bill to hold the administration accountable for their activities and be more responsible to the taxpayers who are paying the bill. Let me just tell you a couple of things that if you pass this amendment, what would happen. Well, number one, it would allow the IRS to continue to be involved in America's health care, allow them to impose a tax on those Americans that it decides don't have the right kind of coverage. If you pass this amendment, you're going to allow the IRS to move forward with a new 501c4 regulation that's going to limit free speech, and it's going to happen even before the targeting investigation has even been concluded. You pass this amendment, you're going to allow the administration to expand its use of czars. We talked a lot about the czars over the years. You want more czars? Pass for this. It's going to allow the SEC to collect information on political donations, and it's going to allow for government-funded abortions. So, in my view, this amendment would expand the administration's authority, it would ignore this committee's direction and priorities, and it would let the administration further intrude into American lives. So we should demand more accountability from this executive branch. We shouldn't sit back and let the administration further attempt to control American lives. So I urge a no vote.
There being, Mr. Serrano.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to support the amendment offered by the ranking member to strike some of the most difficult of the riders from the underlying bill. Rather than have a discussion about funding priorities, some members of the majority have decided to enter into the season of partisanship and brinksmanship. With the riders on abortion, needles, Cuba, White House czars, and federal campaign laws, this bill is a wish list from the Tea Party wing of the Heritage Foundation. Legislative riders and funding limitations have become the new earmarks. If you can't build a bridge, then talk about abortion. Americans want jobs, not a Congress that obsesses over a woman's rights to choose. We should not be doing the work of the authorizing committees. Time after time this year, I have listened to my colleagues on the other side complain about how Democratic funding limitation amendments are somehow authorizing an appropriations bill. Yet, now that the shoe is on the other foot, all of a sudden it appears to be acceptable. It seems that when it comes to these special interest riders, the majority is happy to do their work. We need to stop and return this Appropriations Committee to the proper place it should be. We could start by deleting this only list of legislative riders. I joined the ranking member, and I think that this is a great statement that she's making in saying that this bill should be free of these riders. And in fact, as I said before, this is the most difficult part of this bill. You would have bipartisan support in so many possibilities of it if these riders were not on this bill. Thank you.
If there's no further discussion, Mrs. Lowy is recognized to close.
Well, my friends, I'd like to go back to the days when our committee was Democrats, Republicans, and appropriators, and we are the real appropriators. We should be focused, working together to grow the economy, create jobs, build a more secure America. When we should be working together, these riders divide us, create the partisan atmosphere that is a disservice to our constituents. And I do want to just reference the comments before by Dr. Harris, because I appreciate your referencing that study by the NIH. In fact, I've used that to discuss with many of the children I interact with. I think that education is important, but not in this committee regarding the District of Columbia. So thank you for bringing that report to many of our members who may have not have seen it. We must be working together. And again, I want to emphasize these riders just divide us. They create the partisan atmosphere that is a disservice to our constituents. So I feel so strongly that it's time to reject the riders that have nothing to do with being responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars. I ask your support for this amendment so that we can return to the bipartisan tradition of this committee and do our work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The question is on the Lowy amendment. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no. No. Noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a report.
Recorded vote is requested. A sufficient show of support is shown. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt? No. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei? No. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop? Yes. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert? No. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter? No. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw? No. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar? Aye. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson? Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro? Aye. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent? No. Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart? No. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr? Aye. Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah? Aye. Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Fleischman? No. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry? No. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen? No. Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger? No. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris?
No.
Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Ferrer-Butler? Ms. Ferrer-Butler, no. Mr. Honda? Aye. Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter? Aye. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kingston? Mr. Latham? Mr. Latham, no. Ms. Lee? Aye. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy?
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCollum? Ms. McCollum, aye. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunnally? Mr. Owens? Aye. Mr. Owens, aye. Mr. Pastor? Ms. Pingree? Aye. Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price? Aye. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Aye. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby? Aye. Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Roby-Allard? Ms. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Ryan? Aye. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Schiff? Aye. Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano? Aye. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? No. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? No. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo? No. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky? Aye. Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz? Aye. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, aye. Mr. Wolf? No. Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? No. Mr. Yoder, no.
Does any member wish to be recorded or change their vote? Clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 21, nays are 27. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Yoder?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at a desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Yoder.
Chairman, move
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment would prohibit and limit the enforcement of Section 716 of the Dodd-Frank Act that requires most major domestic and foreign banks doing business in the U.S. to push certain swaps activities outside the bank into a separate capitalized entity. That entity is not FDIC insured, does not otherwise access Federal Reserve credit facilities. The swaps activities in Section 17 pushes out currently regulated banks and institutions, including agriculture, farm, and energy commodities. You know, in an effort to resolve many of the challenges after the financial collapse in 2008, House and Senate, the President signed Dodd-Frank financial reform legislation. I think it's an open-ended question. Certainly we have debates back and forth between our parties and in this country about whether that bill has made us safer, has protected consumers, has made the financial system better. Those debates continue to go on. I think we can all admit that at least there are parts of the bill that could be improved upon or changed, and one of those provisions has already passed the House with a broad bipartisan majority, including many members of this committee and both parties. And so I ask you to consider this amendment, which would change and prohibit funding for this provision. Current regulators have argued that pushing these swap or derivative activities results in less regulation from the primary federal banking regulators and the FDIC and would actually lower capital requirements for subsidiaries with a corresponding weakening of the oversight of banks itself, requiring end users to pay more for the cost of these swaps or make swap derivatives transactions too expensive for the consumer or end user to even collateralize. In addition, Section 716 will create a regulatory disadvantage to U.S. banks compared to their European and foreign counterparts. Many financial leaders support this modification, including Federal Reserve Board Chairman Ben Bernanke, who pointed out in 2009 during the Dodd-Frank debates that Section 716 would, quote, make the U.S. financial system less resilient, more susceptible to systematic risk, because forcing commercial activities out of insured depository institutions would weaken both financial stability and strong, prudent regulation. An example of how this works: a farmer receives a loan from a bank to expand their production. Generally, as part of that transaction, a farmer may choose to enter into a swap transaction with that same bank, so if the price of the farm crop goes down, the farmer can recover lost revenue and use the proceeds to pay off their loans. Under Section 716, the farmer now has to enter into a separate transaction with a separate entity other than the bank, which raises the cost of the transaction to the farmer because they now have to set up multiple account relationships and documentation. More importantly, they have now pledged collateral to two different entities, the bank and the swaps provider. Beyond raising costs, the farmer may even prevent the farmer from coming up with enough collateral to get the loan in the first place. Barney Frank, one of the authors of the legislation actually, of Dodd-Frank, actually supported, when he was in Congress, making this change. 70 Democrats voted for this change on the House floor, including Ranking Member Lowy, many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. This essentially is about creating predictability, because this law is going to be having to be enforced very quickly, which is going to require banks to spend money. It's going to require change consumer transactions quickly. So it's about predictability and giving time is of the essence. It's about consumer protection and financial stability. And lastly, it's about jobs. This is about the farmer in your district that wants to be able to get a loan. This is about your constituents and more. And I think when they realize what we've done and they realize that a broad bipartisan support in the House wants to change this and we didn't get it done, they'll be very frustrated going forward. So this is about creating jobs. It's about fixing what is essentially a mistake, I think, and a part of the Dodd-Frank bill that essentially will make the markets less stable, less predictable. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Chairman Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of this amendment, and I want to thank Mr. Yoder for bringing this issue to our attention. As he pointed out, this is very similar to legislation that passed on a bipartisan basis in the House. It's basically a good government fix to a section of Dodd-Frank, which, if it goes into effect, is going to have unintended consequences for farmers and others that are trying to use these swaps just as a hedge as part of their normal business activities. And so what this would do would keep the normal, safe swap activity. That will stay under bank regulation. But it excludes or pushes out the risky financial bets that led to the financial crisis. So it's a good amendment. It's got bipartisan support, and I urge a yes vote on the amendment.
Mr. Serrano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to this amendment. This amendment adds the text of an entire authorizing bill, H.R. 992, to this subcommittee's bill. This amendment would amend Title VII of Dodd-Frank, which provides for key reforms in the markets. The bill would essentially allow financial institutions to keep more risky transactions on their books, exposing our financial system to the same sort of risk that caused so much trouble in 2008. A change like this should not be added to an appropriations bill. Instead, it should be considered as part of regular order and move through the authorizing process. Moreover, the SEC has proposed all rules required under the Dodd-Frank Act, and the agency is working towards finalizing them. To disrupt that process with this amendment would only interfere with the implementation of the reforms contained in the Act and create loopholes in the safety and security of our financial system. As the administration said in its statement on the authorizing bill, regulators should be allowed to finish their work before determinations are made as to what changes, if any, might be necessary in certain areas to improve the effectiveness of these reforms. And I urge opposition to this amendment.
Mr. Moran.
Mr. Chairman, I want to underscore a point that Mr. Serrano just made. It's already passed on the House floor, why do we insist upon putting authorizing legislation on an appropriations bill? You know, I've heard the argument many times that this is authorization on an appropriations bill. We couldn't do that. So why in this case are we adding a whole piece of legislation that's already passed the House onto this appropriations bill? More than a rhetorical question, Mr. Chairman, but you choose not to answer it.
He deserves a scolding, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. Just because. Ms. Capter.
Yes, I rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment. I'm not sure 100% of the members of this committee fully comprehend everything that is being included and excluded in the gentleman's amendment. So, for example, if I'm on the proper amendment, you distinguish between insured depository institutions and changing the language to covered depository institutions. What is the full implication of the substitution of those words? Who does it include? Who does it exclude? You talk about bona fide hedging and traditional bank activities. You know, one of the ways we got in trouble in this country was in moving away from true commodities markets to financially transacting false money. That's what happened in 2000 when traditional banking was thrown out. And so I find it very interesting what the gentleman is trying to do here on an appropriations bill. I'd like to know who's really behind this. Who has enough power to try to bring this before this committee and trying to I have some imaginations of who that might be. You know, when the traditional manner of handling real money and commodities was thrown out in 2000, it was done in a bill that came here in a conference report, and most members didn't even know what they were voting on. And then 2008 happened just a few years after that. Our country got in trouble when we started financializing the value of true commodities. And if you look at the price of oil today, you'll find that a good, 40 to 70 bucks of a barrel is actually not true value. It's merely what Wall Street has done to create false value, and it's causing consumers to pay so much more per gallon for every gallon of gasoline that they buy. So there's something really striking that's happened in the last decade in terms of the way we used to value real money and real commodities inside this country. I think what the gentleman's trying to do is really dangerous, and it doesn't belong in this committee. So I urge my colleagues to vote strongly no against this amendment, and ask yourself the question, who is really behind trying to do this on an appropriations bill?
Mr. Yield is recognized to close. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
The gentleman was suspended. Mr. Bishop.
Thank you. I have the greatest and deepest respect for my colleague, Ms. Capter, but I want to rise in support of this amendment. It's very similar to H.R. 992, which passed the House with broad bipartisan support on October 30th, 2013, by a vote of 292 to 122, with 70 Democrats supporting it and only 3 Republicans voting against it. And of the 70 Democrats that supported it, 7 serve on the Appropriations Committee. But let me just say this. This, I think, would not repeal Section 716, but it would only modify it to limit it to the transactions to be pushed out of banks to only those derivative trades that are similar to those that brought down AIG in the financial crisis. Let me give you an example. A farmer receives a loan from a bank to expand their production. As part of the transaction, the farmer may also choose to enter in a swap transaction with that same bank, so that if the price of the particular farm crop goes down, the farmer can recover the lost revenue and use the proceeds to pay off their loans. Under Section 716 of Dodd-Frank, a farmer would have to enter into that swap transaction with a separate entity other than the bank, either a swaps entity affiliated with the bank or an entirely different entity altogether. This would raise the cost of the transaction to the farmer because he now has to set up a multiple account relationship and documentation. More importantly, he has to pledge collateral to two different entities, the bank and the swaps provider. Facing these two counterparties eliminates the farmer's ability to net the transaction. If the farmer is able to pledge collateral with one entity, the bank, as the value of the farm crop commodity changes, the price is net out, and they aren't forced to post any more collateral. But if they face two separate entities, the bank and the swaps entity, the farmer needs to post additional collateral if the price of the farm crop commodity rises, but he can also use that same collateral that's already been pledged to the bank. This raises the cost to the farmer and may even prevent the farmer from coming up with enough collateral to get the farm in the first place, to get the loan in the first place. So with great deference and respect to my colleague, I strongly urge the committee to adopt this amendment.
Mr. Owens?
I rise in support of the amendment as well. What Mr. Bishop just described really is an understanding of the transaction. What we're doing here with this amendment is allowing the risk to ride with the end user. That's really critical. Where we got into trouble previously was when that risk did not reside with the end user, but with some financial institution. So this is a very reasonable end user amendment. Thank you.
Mr. Yoder is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to appreciate the spirited debate. I want to particularly note the comments of Mr. Bishop and Mr. Owens. I think they clearly articulated the need for this and the practical application. Contrary to, I think, what some of my colleagues argued today, this Section 716 provision actually weakens oversight. It weakens the system. It moves these swaps into non-FDIC, non-regulated banks. This is about strengthening regulation and protecting consumers, and it's one of the reasons that Ben Bernanke argued when that section went in, that it would actually weaken the U.S. financial system, make it less resilient and more susceptible to systematic risk. So if our goals are the same, to eliminate risk, we ought to listen to the experts on this. I think the fact that one of the authors of the bill itself, Barney Frank, had supported changing this in his last year in Congress tells you this has broad bipartisan support. It's the smart thing to do. It protects our consumers. And I think it'd be a helpful step if this committee could endorse it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The question is on the Yoder amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed will say no. No. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Mr. Quigley.
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will read.
Dispense of the reading.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Mr. Chairman, although this is my second year on the committee, I'm starting to feel like Bill Murray in the movie Groundhog Day, where he lives, I'm sure you might appreciate this on other veins, the same day over and over and over and over again, and unfortunately we never seem to eventually get it right. The amendment I'm offering today with my friend from California, Ms. Lee, is exactly the same one we offered last year. I was considering a conversation with C-SPAN, just telling them to run last year's tape of the debate, and we can all go to lunch for 5 or 10 minutes. Not to show how well we performed last time, but to show how ridiculous it is that we need to have the same discussion over and over and over again about the autonomy of the District of Columbia. Once again, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, with all due respect, are trying to restrict how D.C. uses its locally raised funds. These poison pill riders interfere with the regular order and are the things that most seriously threaten the appropriations process. My amendment we are offering is very straightforward. It simply inserts the word federal in Section 810 of the bill to clarify that local D.C. funds can be used as elected officials of D.C. see fit. In this instance, it would allow them to use locally raised funds for abortion services. Now, I understand my friends on the other side of the aisle oppose abortion and oppose federal tax dollars going toward abortion services. But my amendment would not affect the current ban on federal dollars being used for abortion services. It would, however, allow local D.C. dollars to be used for such services. This amendment is not only an issue of choice, it is an issue of whether the members here today truly support local autonomy and a federalist system as they claim. You know, I tell people I like having a residence here in D.C. after sleeping on my office floor for 4.5 years, but I'm not sure I'd like to live here full time. That's because members of this Congress and members of this committee like to use D.C. as a legislative playground, attempting all sorts of legislative contortions in a city hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles away from their home. When it comes to issues such as who can carry a gun and where, and who can marry whom, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are vociferous supporters of states' rights. Yet when it comes to a woman's right to choose, suddenly the decisions of local elected officials are superseded by the decisions of federal elected officials. You can't say that they have a right to local autonomy except when you disagree. That's the whole point of local autonomy. Imagine for a minute that this committee had jurisdiction over your district and that we are making prescriptive decisions that previously were left to you and the local elected officials back in your state. Every other state in the U.S. has the right to use its local funds as it sees fit. But in an effort to score political points, we have decided to constrict the revenues collected by D.C. As it was said before, if you want to control policy here in D.C., you should run for the D.C. City Council. I know everyone in this committee wants to pass this bill, yet we have attached controversial riders to this. Riders are a non-starter. Let's leave the politics out of this bill and stick to policy. You know, I remember reading both parties in 2010 had pledges to America not to put riders on must-pass legislation. Having a right and having access to a right are two different things. I ask support for this amendment.
Chairman Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to the amendment, and the gentleman mentioned the Groundhog Day last year. Actually, if you want to go back to 1996, we could probably go back and read all the transcripts from then, because that's how long this local fund restriction has been in place. It's been in place every year since 1996 except 2010. So that's the ultimate Groundhog Day. I won't enumerate all the years, but it's 96, 97, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been in place, and here we are again. Now, let me just say a word. There's been a lot of talk about the D.C. and local funds. I think most people understand that the federal government has a unique relationship with the city of Washington, D.C. We pay, the federal government pays for the city's courts, we pay to house their prisoners, and we pay for a few other programs. And so Section 8, Article 1 of the Constitution says that we have the power to exercise, in all cases, over this district. And that's what we do. The Home Rule requires that Congress appropriate their local funds. The District Court of Appeals has said that. The District of Columbia has upheld that authority. So we got the authority to appropriate these funds. We have the responsibility of appropriating D.C. local funds to the city, and it's our policy, and has been our policy, as I said, that taxpayers' funds should not be used to fund abortions. And therefore, we have continued this prohibition, the same prohibition that started in 1996 and has been there ever since, with the exception of 2010. So I urge a no vote on this amendment.
Chairman.
Mr. Serrano.
Mr. Chairman, it's interesting that the Chairman, Mr. Crenshaw, my friend, mentioned 2010 when we got rid of this rider. It should be noted that when I was chairman, with your support, the support of this committee, we were able to get rid of just about every rider that was in this bill having to do with Washington, D.C. And the world didn't fall apart. All it did is people were thankful. And here we go again. It's an amazing situation of always trying to tell Washington, D.C. what to do. Now, the chairman makes a point in support of our ability to meddle beyond what the Constitution says that we can do by saying we pay for their courts, we pay for this, we pay for that. Well, we do that for all the 50 states, and we don't treat them like colonies. We only treat the colonies like colonies. And so we should be cognizant of the fact that we continue, and Mr. Quigley used the line I used to use years ago, so I won't use it anymore, like a playground. It really is a situation, and I hate to sound repetitious, where you can go back home and say, I'm strong on this issue, knowing that your own community disagrees with you on it, or your state has already done something about it, opposite to what you're saying, but you're strong on that issue. Where? In Washington, D.C. You impose it on the District of Columbia, and therefore you can say that you're strong on that issue back home. I don't know how long this is going to go on. For a while it disappeared. Now it looks like every writer is coming back. But, you know, D.C., American citizens have a right to govern themselves, and I think that that's one thing that we should continue to look at. Nobody would want that kind of behavior imposed on them. In fact, part of the problem we have in this country right now, according to some people that are members of the other party, is that too much federal government, too much telling us what to do. But now when it comes to D.C., we can still continue to tell them what to do, and that's not too much federal government. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
While we continue the debate, the chair is passing around a letter which you may choose to sign to Alan Nunley, asking that he return to us speedily. So as the letter comes around the tables, you may wish to sign the letter. Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank Mr. Quigley for offering this amendment, and I'm pleased to co-sponsor it. And of course, I rise in strong support. Every year now, I have stood in this committee and highlighted how detrimental and hypocritical this policy rider, which is really a clear violation of the district's home rule, is to the health of women of this district. Along with the prohibition now on federal employees accessing a plan with comprehensive reproductive health care services, the Congress has once again turned its sights to the District of Columbia, its women residents, for health care services. No other jurisdiction or state is told how to use its locally raised revenue, yet this committee is preparing once again to force Congress's view on the District of Columbia, at least force some in Congress's view on the district. It doesn't matter, Mr. Chairman, how long it's been in place. It is just downright wrong. D.C. residents, yes, D.C. residents pay federal taxes. They send their young men and women to war. They deserve to make their own decisions. However you feel about abortion, politicians should not deny a woman's health coverage because of how much money she makes or where she lives. Yet this is exactly what this policy writer does. It targets women of color and the poor and disenfranchised women in this district. In fact, 93% of Washingtonians whose access to abortion care is restricted by this ban are women of color. And you know that the Hyde Amendment prohibits the use of federal funds to provide or promote abortions. Now, my personal view is that the Hyde Amendment should be overturned. But the unfortunate fact of the matter is that the removal of the D.C. abortion ban would not alter the current prohibition against federal funding of abortion services, and you all know that. Mr. Chairman, D.C. is the only area in the country with this federally mandated prohibition. Why in the world should we force this on the District of Columbia? As I've said before, district women, they have no vote in Congress. Only the district's mayor and elected officials are accountable to the D.C. residents, not me, not you. And their respected, duly elected representative, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, has spoken out strongly against the imposition of non-resident members of Congress's, their ideology on her congressional district, even when those same members of Congress attempted to silence her on several occasions. A woman in the District of Columbia struggling to make ends meet must have the ability to make important personal decisions with their own position based on what is best for her family and her circumstances. Federal funds, mind you, don't allow this. They do not allow this. Now, why in the world would you want to continue to prevent the District of Columbia from using their own local funds for whatever purposes they so desire? The residents of the D.C. are smart enough to make their own decisions. So it's past time now that Congress stop playing politics with D.C.'s home rule and the women of this district, and stop allowing members from other parts of the country to dictate women's decisions based on local funding requirements. So it's time to end this ideological posturing. That's what it really is. D.C. residents should be able to make their own decisions. Local funds should be used for whatever the D.C. residents and local elected officials say they want to be used for. So thank you again. I urge a yes vote on this amendment.
Mr. Quigley is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The ultimate inequity residing in this policy is that a woman with resources can make a decision on whether or not to grow their families, while a woman without resources, many of whom live in the District of Columbia, are left with no choice while they struggle to make ends meet. Choice is at the heart of this issue, but it's not a choice for us to make. It's a choice for women and their families, a choice between women and their doctors. It's a choice we shouldn't allow ourselves to do, particularly in this committee. I ask for a yes vote.
The question is on the Quigley amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed will say no. No. No seem to have it.
Ask for a roll call.
Roll call is requested. There's sufficient support being shown. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt? No. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei? No. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop? Yes. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert? No. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter? No. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw? No. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar? Aye. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson? No. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro? Aye. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent? Aye. Mr. Dent, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr? Aye. Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah? Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen? Mr. Frelinghuysen, aye. Ms. Granger? Ms. Granger? Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Herrera-Butler? Ms. Herrera-Butler, no. Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter? Aye. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kingston? Mr. Latham? Mr. Latham, no. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy? Aye. Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum? Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunnally? Mr. Owens? Aye. Mr. Owens, aye. Mr. Pastor? Aye. Mr. Pastor, aye. Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Aye. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Robo-Allard? Ms. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano? Aye. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? No. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo? No. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visclosky? Aye. Mr. Visclosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz? Aye. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, aye. Mr. Wolf? No. Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder?
Are there members who wish to
Mr.
be
Yoder?
reported?
Mr. Yoder, no.
Mr. Fatah?
Mr. Fatah, aye.
Mr. Kingston?
Mr. Kingston, no.
Any other members wish to change their vote? Clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 24, the nays are 26. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Harris.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The amendment, I offer the amendment, or amendments to the desk designated Harris number 1.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Harris at the end of the bill.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Mr. Chairman, you know, we already have sections 613 and 614 in the bill, which are affectionately referred to as the Smith Amendment, even though there are 2 limitations that just get carried forward year to year, that basically say that since the FEHBP is administered by OPM, that no money should be used to pay for abortions under those plans except for rape, incest, and life of the mother. With the Affordable Care Act, it now created a second class of plans that are administered by OPM, the multi-state plans, which are administered by OPM but not covered under the Smith Amendment, because the Smith Amendment specifically talks about FEHBP because those were the only plans that OPM administered when that amendment was adopted. So this amendment in front of the committee merely extends that same protection against use of taxpayer funds to pay for administrative costs of plans that cover abortions except in the case of rape, incest, or life of the mother. So it extends the Smith Amendment to the multi-state plans, which are also administered by OPM under the Affordable Care Act. And I move the amendment.
Chairman Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong support of this amendment. This is an amendment that was it's similar to an amendment offered by Mr. Nunley 2 years ago, which was adopted. I think the sponsor adequately explained it. It makes it clear that it's consistent with the Hyde Amendment. So I urge adoption of this amendment.
Mr. Serrano.
To quote an American president, Ronald Reagan, there you go again.
There you go again.
I rise in opposition to the amendment. The writer that this amendment would create is an abuse of this bill and an insult to women. It is a vast restriction on women's rights, and a sneaky one at that. It is also an attack on the Affordable Care Act, which we can't seem to pass up an opportunity to do. Carefully crafting an amendment to restrict a woman's right to choose is bad enough. Modifying language that has been agreed upon for years to do so is even worse. The issue at hand was decided long ago. The Appropriations Bill is not the place to unwind that agreement. I urge a no vote on this amendment.
Ms. Washington-Schultz. Oh, Ms. Lowy.
Quite all right. My colleagues, I oppose this extreme amendment. Let's be very clear about what this language would do. It would go so far as to prohibit any multi-state health plan from offering abortion services. Current law already prohibits federal funds from being used to pay for abortion services. The Affordable Care Act went a step further by requiring women purchasing coverage through marketplaces to use private funds to pay for abortion coverage, and it requires that one of the multi-state plans not offer coverage for abortion services. Apparently, those provisions, which were written by anti-choice legislators, are inadequate for extremists hell-bent on denying safe and legal health services to women, even through private insurance plans. This amendment is not aimed at segregating federal funds from abortion. It's intended, pure and simple, to restrict a woman's ability to access a safe and legal medical procedure. Frankly, I'm baffled by the hypocrisy in this policy. It is intellectually dishonest to say we need a more limited government and then intentionally use the reach of the federal government to restrict a woman's ability to purchase a health insurance plan of her choosing. Why must this amendment go so far as telling insurance providers they cannot even offer this service if they wish to be part of an exchange? Year after year, the extreme right attempts to punish women for the choices they have the legal ability to make. This language limits coverage options for women and their families. Nearly 87% of employer-sponsored plans cover a full range of safe and legal health services. Those multi-state plans couldn't be offered in marketplaces under the amendment and could limit health choices for all Americans. Women expect their health coverage to meet their needs, should not be subject to attempts to politicize the decisions they make with their doctors. Let's oppose this misguided and mean-spirited amendment.
Mr. Portberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's important to point something out, that in March of 2010, President Obama signed an executive order, and it's entitled this: the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act's consistency with longstanding restrictions on the use of federal funds for abortion. The President did this to ensure that the new health care law, including the future multi-state plan program administered by OPM, would conform to long-standing government policy. So I want to thank Dr. Harris for his attention to this matter. It simply enforces the intent of President Obama's executive order.
Ms. Wasserman-Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong opposition to this amendment, and more importantly, we should straighten out the actual facts on this. This amendment does not prevent federal funds from being used to pay for abortion because no such thing is happening. Federal law requires plans in the marketplace, including OPM-administered multi-state plans, to segregate federal funding from abortion coverage beyond life endangerment, rape, and incest. This provision in the ACA was explicitly intended to ensure that federal funding did not go toward abortion except in narrow and dire circumstances. The ACA also requires that one of the two multi-state plans offered in each state marketplace must not offer abortion coverage except in cases of life endangerment, rape, and incest, so that those citizens that want a multi-state plan but do not want a plan that covers abortion have an option. And lastly, federal regulation explicitly prohibits a multi-state plan from offering coverage of abortion in a state that prohibits such coverage. Now let me be clear, I don't bring these restrictions or provisions up and to your attention because I agree with them. The United States Supreme Court has upheld a woman's right to reproductive choice, and the only thing most of these provisions do is make it even more difficult for women to access that right. But I bring these provisions up to show that this amendment offered by Representative Harris clearly has nothing to do with ensuring federal funds aren't going toward abortions. Instead, it is yet another attempt to prevent women from having complete control over decisions regarding their reproductive health. It is another attempt to insert politicians between a woman and her doctor when it comes to her family planning. It is another attempt to limit choice by limiting access. And we know these attempts stand to hurt disproportionately low-income women the most, women whose only affordable option may be a multi-state plan. I urge my colleagues in this committee to trust that women know what's best for their own bodies, to understand that that decision should be between her and her doctor, to understand that it is the job of insurance plans to provide for the needs of women, and to vote no on this amendment. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Farr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong opposition because I think I don't know if they're intended or unintended consequences. I mean, first of all, I'm surprised, Doctor, that you're bringing this because your state probably has the most liberal abortion laws of any state in the nation. And then to come here and tell us and other states, who, and particularly all of us in Congress, who buy our insurance through the D.C. exchange, that no company that's a multi-state company, like the Blue Crosses and Kaisers and Aetnas and all of those, that they can provide these services to the private sector. I mean, California corporations offer these insurance plans to their employees. This has such broad range consequences that it certainly is legislating on an appropriations bill. There's no doubt about it, and it ought to be ruled out of order unless you have a rule covering it, which makes hypocrisy of this committee whenever we talk about that. But I mean, every woman working for Congress ought to be appalled that us male committee is going to vote on this amendment. This is a decision that ought not to be in this law.
Mr. Laurel.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to associate myself with my Democratic colleagues in their commentary about the insidiousness of this amendment. But I am deeply, I think it ought to be examined in one way. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle have an unbelievably perverse obsession with women's reproductive systems and women's reproductive rights. It all by way of defines the low opinion that so many of them have of women, their lack of trust of women and what their lives are about, and quite frankly, their lack of respect of women. whether the women who work in this institution or the women who are outside of this institution. I think we ought to just try to set aside some dollars for a study of why this perverse obsession with women's reproductive systems that exists on the other side of the aisle. They appear not to be able to help themselves. And it's staggering what they are prepared to do and to wreak havoc on women's lives. And again, it's because more seriously about the lack of trust in women and the lack of respect for women in this nation.
Ms. Roby.
I'd just like to address the gentlelady's remarks about this perverse obsession with women's reproductive rights.
Systems.
We're talking about abortion, so let's use the word abortion.
We don't pay.
And let's also not forget that there are two people involved here. There is the life of the unborn that deserves protection.
Will the gentlelady yield? Will the gentlelady yield? Yield it back. We do not fund abortion at the federal level.
Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Of course, I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. And this is nothing more than another anti-choice rider in this bill. Now, it's mind-boggling to believe now and to realize that this amendment came to us that would prevent all women from accessing health through the Affordable Health Care Act. The exchanges from accessing abortion coverage using their own private health insurance plan paid for with their own money. You guys just won't give up. This is another battlefront in this war of women. Some say there's no war on women taking place. There is a war on women, and I think this morning's committee hearing has emphasized and manifested that very clearly. The Hyde Amendment, once again, I think it should be repealed, but it continues to prevent the use of federal funds to pay for abortions. Furthermore, the Affordable Care Act already requires that at least one multi-state plan offered in each marketplace must not cover abortion beyond life endangerment, rape, and incest. Again, I think this should be changed. The ACA also prohibits these plans from offering coverage for abortion in the state that prohibits this coverage. Finally, just for the record, the ACA does not fund abortions. We have said that over and over and over again, and you all know that. It provides access for affordable health care, including a full range of reproductive health care services, which every woman in this country has a right to. Women are more than capable of deciding what's best for their health and their families. We need to keep government and we need to keep members of Congress out of these very personal decisions that women make. So I urge a no vote on this amendment, and once again, I'm just reminding everyone that this war on women continues, and it's raging, and it's increasing, and we've got to fight back. As a woman, as a woman who has 3 granddaughters, you know, all of us, you know, care about women's health, and girls, young girls should be able to go to their parents. Women should be able to go talk to their health care provider. These decisions are very personal, and they don't need your interference. So I ask for a no vote.
Mr. Stewart?
Mr. Chairman, I feel I have to rise to respond. Right. I have to rise to respond to some of the comments that have made here. I've been told that I have a perverse obsession with women's reproductive systems. I've been told I have a low self-esteem of women. I've been told I have a lack of respect for women. I've been told I have a lack of trust in women. I would ask the individuals who hold that view and who make those accusations to come and talk to my 2 beautiful daughters and ask them if I have a lack of trust, a lack of respect for them. Go ask my wife if I have a lack of trust in her judgment, if I have a lack of respect for her because she is a woman, because that just simply is not true.
Will the gentleman yield?
No, I will not yield.
I figured.
And finally, let me say this. I've been told that as a man, I can't make a moral judgment about this simply because I am a man. All of us have to make moral judgments. Whether you're a man, whether you're a woman, we all have a right and a responsibility to make moral judgments. And that's all we're asking to do here today. Do you want me? Yes or no? Well, with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Honda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had some comments here that covered everything that my colleagues have covered. So I decided not to repeat it because my daddy always said, you know, you don't want to chew boiled cabbage twice. And if it's been said already, why repeat it? But I think that since my colleague on the other side felt persuaded to stand up and talk about himself and his family, I too would do the same thing. And I think that it's the you that we use is a collective you. But I think one of the things I've learned over the years that I've been in policy making is that my parents taught me values. And my parents also told me that you don't impose your values on other people. If you ask my own family, we have our own values, we have our own restrictions, and we have our own practices. But policy making is not about imposing our own moral values in the way we want to run our families on other families. You give them choices, but you don't impose it. And that's what's going on right now. And if people feel like there's a war on women,
Hey, Tom,
and women are saying it,
let me see your book.
then there must be some truth to it. And we have to keep repeating the same kinds of restrictions that's already in law, that's already in statute. It's just like my father was saying. It's like chewing boiled cabbage twice. I think that's disgusting. And my father was a pretty wise guy. And I think that we ought to sit and think about what it is we're doing and understand that we believe in our own families and we should raise them that accordingly, our own values. But there's nowhere in the Constitution that says we impose our values upon other people. Yield back.
Ms. Capter?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to give a point of view in listening to what both sides have said, that I think for each of us, the life and death tensions that and the passages that we face in our own families are the most difficult moments of conscience that any of us may be asked to walk through. And I, for one, am unwilling to make moral judgments on other people in those times of great family crisis. I will say that I'm proud of everyone who's spoken today on both sides because, at least in our country, we give voice to what the American people are feeling. Unlike some other countries I've traveled in, whether it's China or Russia, I doubt that their parliaments would have given this kind of consideration today. And I would hope that the rancor that can occur would be diminished by leaders in our country, because no family finds these life passages very easy. And I think it's a credit to our country that we value life. We mention it at the very beginning of the preamble of our own Constitution. But I also think that it's important to diminish the possibility for tension and for rancor in our own midst, because the issues are too important. I also wanted to say that we as a country, it seems to me, have reached, and all polls show this, that the American people think that the Hyde Amendment should remain as the law of the land, but also so should the decision on Roe versus Wade. And so we walk through this moment in our own history with that tension. But we're managing to govern despite the tension. And I think that people can hold their own personal views and act accordingly. But I maybe unusual in saying I'm proud of this committee this morning. We got a little bit to the edge at some moments here. But basically, we are walking forward with disagreements, for sure, but with laws in place that govern our society as a whole, that do leave individual choice there for people if they wish it, but also with a respect for life and for life's passages that each of our families will pass through, both at the beginning and at the end of life. So I just wanted to state that I can't support the gentleman's amendment. I was a part of negotiating the executive order when the Affordable Care Act passed. And I will say this, I think in some ways this is maybe a reflection of some disagreement with the Affordable Care Act, but as one member of Congress, I feel that's the most pro-life act that we have passed in my service of 32 years. 40 million people that have a chance at life now who did not have health insurance. So though we may disagree with that, I think overall we've moved our country forward, and we shouldn't allow this issue to subsume, to override what we did with the Affordable Care Act. I think in some ways these amendments try to get at the Affordable Care Act through the abortion issue, and I don't think that that's fair. So, but anyway, overall, I'm proud of this committee this morning.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? Dr. Harris?
Thank you very much.
Recognized to close.
I want to thank the gentlelady from Ohio for her comments. I agree with a lot of them. First of all, I do want to thank Mr. Nunnally, although he's not here. He would have offered this amendment had he been here. He's done a lot of the work on it, and I just carried the water on it. I do want to comment about a perverse obsession with women's reproductive systems, because in obstetric anesthesiologist for 25 years, I don't think my patients agreed with that, with me having a perverse obsession, but that is beyond what we should be discussing. Finally, look, this is the Smith provisions. This is not new language. This is language in 613, 614 of the bill. It only applies it to the other OPM policies that are now administered. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the time.
The question is on the Harris amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed will say no. No. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Request for a recorded vote. If you desire, raise your right hand. Sufficient number. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Aye. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, aye. Mr. Bishop? No. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert? Aye. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter? Aye. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Crenshaw? Aye. Mr. Crenshaw, aye. Mr. Cuellar? Aye. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson? Aye. Mr. Culberson, aye. Ms. DeLauro? Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Dent? Aye. Mr. Dent, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Farr? No. Mr. Farr, no. Mr. Fattah? Mr. Fleischman? Aye. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Fortenberry, aye. Mr. Feelingeisen? Mr. Feelingeisen, aye. Ms. Granger? Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, aye. Dr. Harris? Aye. Dr. Harris, aye. Ms. Herrera-Butler? Ms. Herrera-Butler, aye. Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda, no. Mr. Joyce? Aye. Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter?
No.
Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kingston? Aye. Mr. Kingston, aye. Mr. Latham? Aye. Mr. Latham, aye. Ms. Lee? No. Ms. Lee, no. Mrs. Lowy?
No.
Mrs. Lowy, no. Ms. McCullum? No. Ms. McCullum, no. Mr. Moran?
No.
Mr. Moran, no.
Joe.
Mr. Nunnally? Mr. Owens? No. Mr. Owens, no. Mr. Pastor? No. Mr. Pastor, no. Ms. Pingree? No. Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Price? No. Mr. Price, no. Mr. Quigley? No. Mr. Quigley, no. Mrs. Roby? Aye. Mrs. Roby, aye. Mr. Rogers?
Aye.
Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Rooney? Aye. Mr. Rooney, aye. Ms. Robo-Allard? No. Ms. Robo-Allard, no. Mr. Ryan? No. Mr. Ryan, no. Mr. Schiff? No. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Serrano?
No.
Mr. Serrano, no. Mr. Simpson?
No. Aye.
Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart? Aye. Mr. Stewart, aye. Mr. Valadeo? Aye. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Mr. Visklosky? No. Mr. Visklosky, no. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz? Aye. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, no. Mr. Wolf? Aye. Mr. Wolf, aye. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, aye. Mr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder, aye.
Are there members who wish to be recorded? Members who wish to change their vote? Mr. Fatah?
No.
Mr. Fatah, no.
Are there others? Clerk will tally. While we are waiting on the tally, the letter to Alan Nunley has made its way around. I think it's to Mr. Serrano now. If you have, if you miss signing the letter, it'll be laying up here with the clerk after the session. Some of you may have been out of the room when the letter came past your place. And I thank you for signing the letter. He will appreciate that deeply. On this amendment, the yeas are 29, the nays are 21. The amendment is agreed to. Are there amendments? If not, Chairman Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move to favorably report the Financial Services and General Government Appropriations Bill for fiscal year 2015 to the House.
All in favor of the motion, say aye. Aye. All opposed, no? No. The ayes seem to have it. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Roll call is requested. All those in favor will raise your right hand. A sufficient number. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Crenshaw, aye. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, aye. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Dent. Mr. Dent, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Farr. Mr. Farr, no. Mr. Fatah. Mr. Fatah, no. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, aye. Mr. Frelinghuysen. Mr. Frelinghuysen, aye. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, aye. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, aye. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Mr. Honda. Mr. Honda, no. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kingston. Mr. Kingston, aye. Mr. Latham. Mr. Latham, aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, no. Mrs. Lowy. Mrs. Lowy, no. Ms. McCullum. Ms. McCullum, no. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Nunley. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens, no. Mr. Pastor. Mr. Pastor. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, no. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, no. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, aye. Mr. Rogers.
Aye.
Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Rooney.
The clerk is having difficulty hearing. Please exit quietly.
Mr. Rooney, aye.
Bishop.
Hold on. Ms. Roby-Allard. Ms. Roby-Allard, no. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan, no. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano.
No.
Mr. Serrano, no. Mr. Simpson.
Aye.
Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, aye. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Mr. Visklosky. Mr. Visklosky, no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mr. Wolf. Mr. Wolf, aye. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, aye. Mr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder, aye.
Are there members who wish to be recorded? Mr. Bishop.
Mr. Bishop, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded?
Ms. Herrera-Butler.
Ms. Herrera-Butler.
Ms. Herrera-Butler, aye.
Members wish to change their vote. Clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 28, the nays are 21. The motion is agreed to. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be given the authority to make technical and conforming change to the items approved today. With that objection so ordered, There being no further business, 3-day notice is allowed. No further business. Committee stands adjourned.